They bought a $75 million private estate to celebrate a marriage built on a lie. I stood in the groom's suite wrapped in gold leaf and imported silk, but all I could feel was the cold weight of a $20 watch on my wrist. My name is Declan Hayes. I am a 36-year-old senior financial auditor. For more than a decade, I built my career tearing apart balance sheets, hunting down corporate fraud, and finding the lies that wealthy people tried to hide in the fine print. I have stared down corrupt executives and dismantled shell companies without blinking, yet I completely failed to see the trap being built around my own life. I ignored every warning sign because I loved my fiancée, Caroline Sterling. I loved her enough to look past the blinding arrogance of her family. I loved her enough to risk everything I had worked for. But love does not protect you from people who view human beings as assets to be liquidated. It was 8 a.m. on my wedding day. Outside the Trinity Cathedral in Boston, a fleet of black luxury cars was already lining up. 500 of the wealthiest elites in New England were taking their seats preparing to watch the union of the Sterling real estate dynasty with a working-class auditor from the suburbs. The air inside the groom's suite was suffocating. It smelled of heavy floral arrangements and the polished oak of antique furniture. I stood in front of a massive gilded mirror adjusting a tuxedo that I did not choose and could not afford. The Sterlings had insisted on paying for everything, framing it as a generous gift. I know now that they were simply buying my silence. They were dressing up their scapegoat to look presentable before the slaughter. I looked down at my left hand. Peeking out from the sleeve of the custom tuxedo was the scratched, faded silver watch my grandmother Ruth had given me on the day I graduated college. It was cheap, the glass was chipped, and the second hand always ticked a little too loudly. Caroline had begged me to take it off for the ceremony. She had actually bought me a $50,000 platinum timepiece to replace it, telling me I needed to look the part of a Sterling. But I refused. That cheap silver watch was the only honest thing in this entire cathedral. It was a reminder of the woman who raised me. A woman who scrubbed floors and worked double shifts just to make sure I had a roof over my head. My grandmother died 2 years ago, but her voice still lived in my head, constantly reminding me to never let money blind my judgment. I should have listened to her sooner. The heavy oak door of the suite swung open. There was no knock. There was no polite greeting. Harrison Sterling stepped into the room like he owned the building, the air, and the ground beneath my feet. Harrison was 38 years old, Caroline's older brother, and the heir to a real estate empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He wore a custom suit that fit him like armor, his hair perfectly styled, his jaw set in a permanent sneer. He looked at me not as a future brother-in-law, but as a pest he was about to exterminate. Harrison did not say a word at first. He simply walked to the center of the room and dropped a thick black leather folder onto the mahogany table between us. The folder hit the wood with a heavy, final thud. Beneath the folder, a small, worn white envelope slid across the polished surface and stopped right at the edge of the table. I stared at the folder, then back up at Harrison. My training as an auditor kicked in immediately. When a man like Harrison Sterling enters a room on the morning of a wedding with a legal document, it is never a negotiation. It is an ambush. "Take that piece of junk off your wrist," Harrison said. His voice was cold, flat, and dripping with contempt. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my grandmother's watch. "You are embarrassing my sister, and you are embarrassing this family. We gave you a platinum watch. Put it on. I will not have my guests looking at you and remembering that you grew up in a house that costs less than my current car." I kept my hands at my sides. I refused to let him see the anger spiking in my chest. I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted to diminish my worth before making his demands. It was a classic negotiation tactic designed to make the opponent feel small and powerless. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "The watch stays, Harrison," I said, my voice steady. "Caroline already knows that. What do you want? The ceremony starts in exactly 2 hours. Harrison let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned over the table, pressing his knuckles against the wood. "The ceremony starts in 2 hours if you sign that document, Declan. If you do not sign it, I will walk out there right now and tell 500 of our closest friends that the wedding is off." I will tell them that you tried to extort my family, that you are a gold digger, and that we threw you out onto the street where you belong." I frowned, stepping closer to the table. "We already signed the prenuptial agreement 3 months ago, Harrison. We signed it with both of our lawyers present. I agreed to take absolutely nothing from the Sterling estate in the event of a divorce. I made it perfectly clear that I am not interested in your money. I am marrying Caroline, not your bank accounts." "The situation has changed," Harrison replied, his eyes narrowing. "That old contract is void. This is the new agreement. You are going to sign it right now without your lawyer and without asking questions. If you refuse, I will not just cancel this wedding. I will personally ensure that your career at the accounting firm is destroyed by noon tomorrow. I know your boss. I know your clients. I can have you blacklisted in the financial sector before you even leave this church. You will never audit a single spreadsheet in this city again." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained perfectly still. I am an auditor. I deal with threats, intimidation, and high-pressure tactics from desperate executives all the time. But this was different. This was my wedding day. This was the man who was supposed to be my family. I looked down at the black leather folder. A new prenuptial agreement, presented hours before the wedding. No legal representation present. Coercion. Threats of career sabotage. Every single alarm bell in my professional brain was screaming at me to run out the door. "You want me to sign a legally binding financial contract under duress less than 2 hours before a wedding without my attorney present?" I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "Do you realize how incredibly stupid that is, Harrison? No judge in this state would ever uphold a contract signed under these conditions." Harrison smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow smile. "You think we care about a judge? You think the laws that apply to you apply to us? We have enough lawyers on retainer to bury you in litigation until you are 60 years old. Declan, we will freeze your assets, drain your savings, and drag your name through the mud. You are a nobody. You have a little job, a little apartment, and a little life. We own this city. Now pick up the pen and sign the document, or pack your bags and get out." The room felt like it was shrinking. I looked at the black folder again. The arrogance of the Sterlings was entirely unmatched. They truly believed that their wealth made them gods, immune to consequence and immune to failure. They believed they could crush anyone who stood in their way simply by throwing enough money at the problem. But as I reached out to grab the folder, my eyes drifted to the small, worn white envelope resting beneath it. I had completely ignored the envelope when Harrison threw the folder down. But now, seeing it up close, my breath caught in my throat. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting across the front was undeniable. It was written in faded blue ink, the letters slightly shaky but deeply familiar. It was my grandmother Ruth's handwriting. I froze. My grandmother had been dead for 2 years. She passed away right before I met Caroline. How on earth did Harrison Sterling have a letter written by my dead grandmother? "Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice finally cracking. I snatched the envelope off the table, holding it up. "Where did you get this letter, Harrison?" Harrison rolled his eyes, looking incredibly bored. "It arrived at the estate yesterday, addressed to you. Caroline was going to throw it in the trash, but I figured I would bring it to you as a parting gift. Go ahead and read it. Maybe your dead relatives have some financial advice for you, since you are clearly too stupid to take mine." I ignored his cruel words. My hands were actually shaking as I tore open the envelope. The paper inside felt fragile. I recognized the stationery immediately. It was the same cheap notepad paper my grandmother used to use to write grocery lists. I unfolded it carefully, my heart pounding loud enough to drown out the ticking of the silver watch on my wrist. There was only one sentence written on the page. It was written in thick, deliberate letters, as if she had used all her remaining strength to press the pen into the paper. I read the words once, then I read them again, feeling the blood drain completely from my face. "Declan, call off the engagement. That family does not buy love, they buy pawns." A cold sweat broke out across my neck. My grandmother had never met Caroline. She had never met the Sterlings. She died before Caroline and I even went on our first date. Yet here was a letter undeniably written in her hand, warning me to run, warning me that I was being purchased, not loved. How was this possible? Did she know something about this family before she died? Did she have some connection to the Sterlings that she never told me about? I looked at the words again. They buy pawns. A pawn is someone you sacrifice to protect the king. A pawn is someone you put in the line of fire to take the fall. My analytical mind, the mind of a senior financial auditor, snapped into high gear. I suddenly stopped looking at the situation like a heartbroken groom and started looking at it like an investigator. Harrison was desperate. He was hiding it behind arrogance, but his actions were desperate. You do not force a groom to sign a new prenuptial agreement 2 hours before a wedding unless you urgently need his signature on something that cannot wait. If they just wanted to protect their money, the original contract was perfectly fine. It secured all their assets. So what was in this new folder? What was so important that Harrison was willing to sabotage his own sister's wedding to get it signed? They do not buy love, they buy pawns. I slowly placed my grandmother's letter back onto the mahogany table. I took a deep breath, pushing the shock and the grief down into a locked box in the back of my mind. The fear that had been gripping my chest entirely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. Harrison was expecting me to crumble. He was expecting the poor boy from the suburbs to cower under the weight of his family's money and sign whatever was put in front of him just to keep the peace. He had grossly underestimated me. I am not a pawn. I am an auditor. And I was about to find every single lie he tried to hide in this document. I reached out and pulled the thick black leather folder toward me. I flipped the heavy cover open. The document inside was 60 pages long, printed in dense, single-spaced legal jargon designed to confuse and exhaust the reader. It was a classic corporate tactic. Hide the poison in the middle of a massive block of text, hoping the victim is too stressed to read it properly. I knew what to look for. Indemnity clauses, asset transfers, liability offloading. Harrison smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. Just skip to the last page and sign it, Declan. You do not have the time or the brain power to read all of that. The guests are waiting. Caroline is waiting. Do not ruin her day because of your stubborn pride. I did not answer him. I did not even look at him. I stared at the first page of the contract, scanning the definitions and the liability clauses. My eyes tracked across the text with the speed and precision of a machine. I was looking for the anomaly. I was looking for the trap. And I knew exactly where people like Harrison Sterling always hid their secrets. The ticking of my grandmother's silver watch seemed to grow louder in the quiet room, keeping perfect time with the racing of my thoughts. I was not just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for my life. I did not throw a punch. Every primal instinct inside my body screamed at me to cross the room and shatter Harrison Sterling's perfect jaw. I wanted to grab him by the lapels of his custom suit and throw him against the mahogany door. But violence is the language of men who have lost control. I was a senior financial auditor. I spent my entire adult life dealing with arrogant men who believed their bank accounts made them invincible. When cornered, I do not lash out. I analyze. I stepped back from the table, letting the silence stretch between us. The ticking of my grandmother's watch anchored me to reality. Harrison took my silence for submission. He smiled a cold and hollow expression that did not reach his eyes. He began to pace around the groom's suite, treating the space like a courtroom where he was the judge, jury, and executioner. "You really thought you could pull this off?" Harrison said, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you could just charm your way into a family worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We have been watching you since the day Caroline brought you to the estate. You are nothing but a gold digger, Declan, a pathetic, calculated stalker who saw a vulnerable woman and decided to secure a retirement plan." The words were designed to strip away my dignity. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to shout, to defend my love for his sister, to prove my worth. I refused to give him that power. Instead, I focused entirely on the thick black leather folder resting on the table. The document he was so desperate for me to sign. Why now? Why wait until 2 hours before the ceremony? The timing was a calculated pressure tactic. He needed me panicked. He needed me blind. But I have spent a decade finding the truth buried in thousands of pages of corporate lies. I placed my hands flat on the table and opened the folder. "Read it all you want." Harrison mocked, leaning against the back of a velvet armchair. "You do not have the time to understand it, and you certainly do not have the leverage to negotiate. You sign the paper or you walk out that door. And if you walk, I will march right into the cathedral and tell 500 of the most powerful people in New England exactly what you are. I will tell them you tried to extort us. I will destroy your reputation before the organist even finishes warming up." I ignored him. My eyes scanned the first page. Standard definitions. Parties involved. The Sterling Family Trust. Declan Hayes. Caroline Sterling. I flipped to the second page. The legal jargon was incredibly dense, constructed with labyrinthine sentences designed to exhaust the reader. To a normal groom, this would look like standard wealthy family paranoia. To an auditor, it looked like a maze hiding a trapdoor. I flipped another page, then another. My heart rate slowed down. The emotional devastation of the morning was temporarily locked away behind a wall of professional focus. I was no longer a man betrayed by his future brother-in-law. I was a hunter looking for the snare. On page 14, the language shifted. It moved away from the standard division of assets and into the realm of indemnity and liability. My eyes caught a specific phrase: total assumption of fiduciary responsibility. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the paragraph again, tracing the words with my eyes to make absolutely sure I was not hallucinating. This was not a prenuptial agreement designed to protect Caroline's money from me. This was an assignment of liability. They were transferring legal ownership and total accountability of 3 offshore trust funds directly to my name. "What is the matter?" Declan Harrison taunted, noticing my pause. "Did you find the section where it says you get absolutely nothing if she divorces you? Because that is the reality. You leave this marriage with the exact same empty pockets you brought into it." I was lying. He was actively trying to misdirect my attention. I kept reading my mind, moving faster than a machine. The trusts were registered in the Cayman Islands. They were structured as high-yield investment vehicles, but the clauses attached to them were terrifying. By signing this document, I would acknowledge that I was the sole managing director of these funds. I would be accepting full responsibility for their past financial activities, their current tax obligations, and any future legal liabilities. The Sterling family name was completely scrubbed from the governance section. They were effectively handing me the keys to a financial vehicle, but they were also strapping me to the engine block and setting it on fire. I flipped quickly to the addendums at the back of the folder. There it was, a schedule of assets detailing the exact amounts moving through those offshore accounts. We were not talking about a few $1,000s. We were looking at tens of millions of dollars moving in patterns that instantly triggered every fraud alert in my brain. Layered transactions, phantom shell companies, irregular wire transfers across international borders. The Sterlings were not just rich, they were hiding money. A massive amount of money. And someone was looking for it. The sudden urgency of this new contract made perfect, terrifying sense. The sheer evil of the plan struck me like a physical blow to the chest. I gripped the edges of the table, feeling the wood dig into my palms. My grandmother's letter burned in my memory. "They do not buy love, they buy pawns." She knew. Somehow she had understood exactly what this family was capable of. They had brought me into their world, dressed me in their clothes, and smiled at me across dinner tables, all while building a prison cell with my name on it. When I looked closer at the schedule of assets, I saw the exact mechanics of their fraud. They were using a complex web of subsidiary holding companies to funnel untaxed capital gains out of their domestic real estate portfolio and into the Cayman trusts. Then they were bringing the money back into the United States through highly inflated consulting fees paid to phantom corporations. It was a classic round-trip tax evasion scheme executed on a massive scale. The sheer arrogance of putting this in writing, even masked by legal jargon, was staggering. They were so confident that I would not read it, or that I would not understand it if I did, that they had essentially handed me a signed confession to federal crimes. But the confession was designed to frame me as the mastermind. The contract specifically stated that the managing director, which would be me upon signing, had sole discretion and historical oversight of all transactional strategies. This meant if the federal authorities raided the Sterling offices tomorrow, Harrison would simply open a safe, pull out this document, and act like a shocked victim. He would tell the agents that his new brother-in-law had taken over the family's private investments and gone rogue. He would claim they had trusted my financial expertise only to be betrayed. It was a flawless setup. They needed a fall guy. They needed a scapegoat to take the blame for the tax evasion and the financial fraud. And they had chosen the working-class auditor from the suburbs. Who would question it? A financial professional marrying into a wealthy family suddenly takes over their trust funds and gets caught embezzling or hiding assets. It was the perfect narrative. The media would devour it. The authorities would secure an easy conviction. The Sterlings would walk away clean, pointing their fingers at the greedy son-in-law who ruined their daughter's life. But the most agonizing thought was not about Harrison. It was about Caroline. My beautiful, brilliant Caroline. The woman who had slept beside me for 2 years. The woman who had promised to stand by me in sickness and in health. Did she know? Was she the architect of this trap? Or was she just another pawn being moved across the board by her brother? I remembered the way she had kissed me last night. I remembered the tears in her eyes when we practiced our vows. My heart screamed that she was innocent. But my auditor brain, the cold and calculating side of me that kept me alive in this room, told a different story. She was a Sterling. She grew up in this culture of deception. She had insisted on the massive wedding. She had insisted on rushing the timeline. She was the one who practically begged me to sign the first contract without reading it thoroughly. "You have 5 minutes, Harrison said, checking his diamond-encrusted watch. "The priest is ready. The guests are seated. Pick up the pen, Declan. Stop pretending you are smart enough to understand any of this. Just sign your name and you can have your little fairy tale wedding." I looked up at him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the contract into pieces and throw it in his face. But the reality of my situation was a vice tightening around my neck. I was trapped in a life or death struggle, and the weapons were ink and paper. If I signed this document, I would be walking straight into a federal indictment. I would spend the best years of my life in a concrete cell branded as a thief and a fraud. I would lose my career, my freedom, and my future. The Sterlings would ensure I had no money for a decent defense attorney. I would be completely crushed by the justice system. But if I refused to sign, the alternative was an immediate and highly publicized execution of my character. Harrison would walk out of this suite and announce to the world that the wedding was canceled. He would spin a story so convincing, so layered with lies that my reputation would never recover. I would lose Caroline. I would be fired from my firm by noon. I would be humiliated in front of 500 people, escorted out of the cathedral by security like a common criminal. I would be a laughingstock, the poor boy who tried to con a wealthy dynasty and failed. They had cut off every possible exit. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. I could hear the faint sound of the pipe organ starting to play in the main sanctuary down the hall. The music swelled a grand and joyful noise that felt like a sick joke compared to the nightmare unfolding in the groom's suite. Hundreds of people were out there smiling, chatting in their designer gowns and tailored suits, completely unaware that they were waiting to witness a financial execution. I stared down at the contract. The paper was thick, expensive. The blank signature line at the bottom of the page seemed to mock me. It demanded my life. It demanded everything I had worked for since I was a child, watching my grandmother scrub floors. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to steady my breathing. I needed a way out. I needed a flaw in their plan. Auditors are trained to find the missing variable, the one piece of data that does not fit the narrative. Harrison stepped closer, invading my personal space. I could smell his expensive cologne, a sharp and aggressive scent that matched his personality. "Are you crying, Declan?" He whispered, his voice a nasty sneer. "Are you actually crying over a piece of paper? Be a man. Take the deal. You get to live in luxury, and all you have to do is take on a little paperwork. Caroline is waiting for you. Do you really want to break her heart?" I was weaponizing her name. He was using the woman I loved to blind me to the reality of the trap. It was a brilliant and utterly ruthless tactic. If I loved her, I would sign. If I did not sign, it meant I did not love her enough to sacrifice my pride. But this was not about pride. This was about survival. My hands stopped shaking. The fear that had been paralyzing my chest suddenly crystallized into a cold, hard anger. It was not the fiery, explosive anger that leads to a fistfight. It was the deep, calculating rage of a man who realizes he has been underestimated. Harrison Sterling looked at me and saw a peasant. He saw a man who could be easily intimidated by wealth and easily manipulated by love. He thought my silence was the sound of my spirit breaking. I was wrong. My silence was the sound of an auditor building a case. I kept my eyes fixed on the document, refusing to let Harrison see the shift in my demeanor. I needed to memorize the names of the trusts. I needed the account routing numbers listed in the appendix. I needed to burn every single detail of this fraudulent contract into my brain because this piece of paper was no longer just a threat. It was evidence. 3 minutes, Declan Harrison barked, tapping his foot against the hardwood floor. My patience is entirely gone. Pick up the pen. I slowly reached for the silver fountain pen resting beside the folder. It was a heavy, beautiful writing instrument engraved with the Sterling family crest, a fitting tool to sign away a man's life. I wrapped my fingers around the cool metal. Harrison let out a long, satisfied breath, relaxing his shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought the working-class boy had finally accepted his place as a pawn. But as I held the pen hovering the tip just inches above the signature line, I knew I was not going to sign. I was going to fight. I did not know how I was going to escape the cathedral without being destroyed by his lies. I did not know how I was going to face the public humiliation, or how I was going to survive the heartbreak of losing Caroline. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would rather walk out of this church with nothing but my grandmother's cheap watch and my integrity than spend the rest of my life paying for the sins of the Sterling family. I lowered the pen, resting the tip against the thick paper, stalling for time, searching for a single crack in his armor, waiting for a miracle. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the suffocating silence of the groom's suite. Harrison had stepped out to take an urgent phone call from their legal team, giving me exactly 5 minutes to sign my life away. The gold clock on the ornate marble mantel ticked relentlessly. It was 9 in the morning. I had exactly 3 hours until I was supposed to stand at the altar and pledge my eternal loyalty to a woman who was actively trying to frame me for federal tax evasion. I stared at the silver fountain pen resting on the table. The dark ink inside it felt like poison. My mind raced through every possible exit strategy, but the Sterling family had built a flawless cage. If I walked out that door, Harrison would destroy my career and my reputation before I even reached the parking lot. If I signed the document, I was legally binding myself to 3 fraudulent offshore trust funds and a guaranteed federal prison sentence. I was a senior financial auditor. I was trained to untangle the most complex corporate lies in the world. I spent my days hunting down missing assets and exposing corrupt executives. Yet here I was completely paralyzed by a piece of paper on my own wedding day. I placed my hands flat against the cool wood of the table, trying to steady my breathing. I needed a flaw in their armor. I needed a single loose thread to pull, but they had buried their financial crimes under a massive mountain of pristine legal jargon. The brass handle of the suite door suddenly turned. I braced myself, my muscles tensing as I expected Harrison to walk back in with his arrogant smirk and demand the signed contract. I prepared my defense, ready to tell him I needed more time to review the indemnity clauses. But the person who slipped through the narrow crack in the door was not Harrison. It was Beatrice Sterling Caroline and Harrison's mother. She was the matriarch of the Sterling real estate empire, a woman who controlled charity boards and high society galas with an iron fist. Under normal circumstances, Beatrice was a woman of terrifying poise. She was usually draped in designer silk, her silver hair perfectly styled, projecting a permanent aura of untouchable wealth and icy superiority. She had never spoken more than 10 words to me at any family dinner. She always looked at me as if I were a slightly unpleasant odor she was being forced to tolerate for the sake of her daughter. But the woman standing in front of me right now looked absolutely nothing like the confident billionaire I knew. Beatrice was trembling violently. Her face was pale, entirely drained of color, making the expensive cosmetics on her skin look like a cheap mask. Her breathing was shallow and erratic, rattling in her chest. She looked over her shoulder into the hallway with wide, terrified eyes before pushing the heavy oak door shut behind her. I watched in total shock as she reached for the brass deadbolt and slid it into the locked position with a loud metallic clack. "Mrs. Sterling," I started to say, stepping back from the table. "What are you doing here?" Harrison said nobody was allowed in the suite until I finished reviewing the paperwork. She did not answer me immediately. She leaned her back against the locked door, pressing her hand against her chest as if she were trying to slow down a hammering heart. Her eyes darted around the luxurious room, scanning the corners as if she expected someone to jump out from the shadows. Then her gaze locked onto the table. She saw the thick black leather folder sitting next to my grandmother's cheap silver watch. She saw the fountain pen I had abandoned. A strange, desperate energy suddenly took over her entire body. Beatrice lunged forward, crossing the plush carpet in 3 rapid steps. Before I could raise my hands to stop her, she snatched the 60-page contract right out of the leather folder. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice rising in sudden panic. I reached out to grab the papers back, thinking this was yet another psychological trick the family was playing on me. Maybe she was going to rip it up and claim I destroyed their property to manufacture a breach of trust. But Beatrice did not hand it to me. She gripped the thick stack of expensive legal paper with both hands and began tearing it straight down the middle. Her knuckles turned white from the intense effort. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed sharply in the quiet room, a violent noise that shattered the tension. She tore the fraudulent contract into halves, then quarters, her breathing growing heavier with every desperate tear. When the document was nothing but a pile of jagged scraps, she walked over to the brass trash can in the corner and dropped the pieces inside. I stood frozen, completely unable to process what I was witnessing. The matriarch of the Sterling family had just destroyed the very trap her son had spent months building to destroy me. "I do not understand," I whispered, staring at the trash can and then back at her. "Your son just threatened to ruin my entire life if I did not sign that exact document. He told me it was the only way I could marry Caroline. Why did you just destroy it?" Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a long, ragged breath. When she opened them again, the icy superiority was completely gone. In its place was a look of profound, agonizing guilt. She stepped closer to me, so close I could smell the sharp scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the undeniable scent of cold sweat. She reached out and grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her manicured fingers digging deeply into the fabric of my tuxedo jacket. "You cannot marry her, Declan," she whispered, her voice trembling but intensely urgent. "You cannot sign anything they give you, and you absolutely cannot stand at that altar today. They are using you. Harrison is terrified of the federal investigators, and Caroline is helping him build the perfect scapegoat." My auditor instincts flared instantly. I already knew they were framing me. I had read the liability clauses. But hearing her admit it out loud shattered the last lingering hope I had that Caroline was innocent. The woman I loved was a willing participant in my destruction. "You know about the offshore accounts?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady, despite the rage building in my chest. "You know they are trying to dump the liability for the tax evasion onto me. Does Caroline know everything? Is she really part of this trap?" Beatrice let go of my arm and covered her face with her hands. A single sob escaped her throat, a sound of pure maternal heartbreak that cannot be faked. "It is worse than tax evasion, Declan," she said, lowering her hands and looking directly into my eyes. "The money they are hiding is just the symptom of a much darker disease. My children are monsters. I raised them, I gave them everything, and I watched them turn into monsters." She took another step closer, glancing at the locked door to make sure no one was trying the handle. She leaned in her face, inches from mine, her voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "My daughter buried the truth once. She is making you the next victim." I stared at her, my blood running completely cold. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with terrifying implications. buried the truth. What truth? What are you talking about, Beatrice? What did Caroline do? Beatrice reached into the pocket of her tailored silk jacket. Her hand was shaking so badly she struggled to pull the object out. Finally, she produced a heavy ring of brass keys. There were at least 10 keys on the ring, old and tarnished, clinking together with a heavy metallic sound that seemed entirely out of place in this pristine environment. Along with the keys, she pulled out a torn piece of thick white cardstock. It looked like the back of a wedding invitation, but someone had scribbled an address on it in frantic, messy handwriting. She shoved the keys and the paper directly into my palm, forcing my fingers to close tightly around them. The metal of the keys felt ice-cold against my skin. "Look at the paper, Declan," she ordered, her voice firming up with sudden, desperate determination. "Read the address." I opened my hand and stared at the torn cardstock. The ink was slightly smudged from her sweating palms, but I could clearly read the words. St. Jude's Sanctuary, followed by a street address located deep in the rural outskirts of the city, at least 40 miles away from the cathedral. "What is St. Jude's Sanctuary?" I asked, looking up at her. "Is it a hospital? A piece of real estate your family is hiding?" Beatrice shook her head, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting paths through her perfect makeup. "It is a private medical facility, a nursing home for people who have been completely forgotten by the world. It is highly secure, highly discreet, and entirely funded by anonymous donors. My family has been paying them a massive amount of money every single month for the past 5 years to keep a certain patient locked inside a specific room." I felt a massive wave of nausea hit my stomach. A hidden patient, a secure facility. My mind desperately tried to connect the offshore financial accounts to a hidden medical facility, but the variables did not match. Financial fraud was a crime of greed. Hiding a human being in a private sanatorium was a crime of pure malice. "Who is in that facility, Beatrice?" I demanded, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and lowered it again. "Who is your family keeping locked away? And what does this have to do with me taking the fall for their financial crimes?" She placed her hands over mine, squeezing my fingers tightly around the cold brass keys. "I cannot explain it to you right now," she whispered, frantically checking the door once more. "If Harrison catches me in this room, he will know I betrayed them. He will lock me away just like he locked them away. You have exactly 3 hours before the ceremony begins. Harrison thinks you are in here reading a 60-page contract. He expects you to be terrified and compliant. You need to use this time to find out who you are really marrying. There is a service elevator at the end of this hallway." Beatrice continued, her words rushing out in a desperate flood of instruction. "It leads directly to the underground parking garage. My car is parked in spot 12. It is the black sedan. These keys will open the car, and the brass key with the square head will open the security gate at St. Jude's. You need to leave right now, Declan. You need to drive to that address and go straight to room 14. You need to see the truth with your own eyes, because if I just tell you the story, you will never believe me. You will still try to find an excuse for Caroline because you love her. But once you see what is inside that room, you will understand exactly what they are capable of, and you will understand why you have to destroy them today." I looked down at the keys in my hand. The weight of the metal felt incredibly heavy. If I left the cathedral now, I would be triggering a massive panic. Harrison would eventually realize I was gone. He would immediately assume I was running away to contact the authorities about the fraudulent contract. He would unleash their legal team, freeze my bank accounts, and start the public smear campaign before I even reached the highway. I would be a fugitive on my own wedding day. But if I stayed here, if I ignored this terrified mother handing me the key to her family's darkest secret, I would be walking blindly to my own execution. My grandmother's letter burned in my memory. "They do not buy love, they buy pawns." Beatrice was offering me a chance to step off the board entirely. She was offering me a chance to stop being a pawn and start becoming the one holding the hammer. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, looking deep into her fearful, tear-filled eyes. "You are risking absolutely everything. If Harrison and Caroline go down for this, your family empire will collapse. You will lose your reputation, your fortune, your entire way of life. Why save me? I am just a working-class auditor from the suburbs. I mean nothing to you." Beatrice let out a bitter, sorrowful laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You mean nothing to my son and daughter Declan. To them, you are just a tool, a convenient signature on a piece of paper to take the blame for their sins. But I am a mother who has spent 5 years suffocating under the crushing weight of a terrible lie. I have watched Caroline smile for the cameras, wear expensive clothes, and pretend to be a perfect grieving woman, knowing all the while that her soul is entirely black. I stood by and did nothing the first time she buried the truth because I wanted to protect my children. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing for the family, but I cannot watch them ruin another innocent man's life. I cannot carry the guilt of your destruction on my conscience, too. Go, now." She stepped back from me and reached for the brass deadbolt on the door. She unlocked it slowly, easing it open just a fraction of an inch to check the hallway. It was completely empty. The sound of the pipe organ practicing in the main sanctuary echoed faintly through the long carpeted corridor, playing a joyful wedding march that felt like a twisted joke. Beatrice turned back to me one last time, her face settling into a mask of tragic determination. "Room 14. She repeated softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the distant music. "Do not let anyone see you enter the medical facility. Use the side security door. Find the truth, Declan. Find the truth and then burn their empire to the ground." She slipped out of the room, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. The quiet returned to the groom suite, but it was no longer suffocating. It was charged with wild, unpredictable electricity. I looked at the brass trash can where the fraudulent contract lay in torn, useless pieces. I looked at the torn cardstock resting in my palm. St. Jude's Sanctuary. My pulse was a steady, powerful drumbeat in my ears, drowning out the ticking of the gold clock. I did not waste another second trying to rationalize the situation. I shoved the heavy brass keys and the piece of paper deep into the pocket of my tuxedo trousers. I grabbed my phone from the table, took one final deep breath, and walked out the door, heading straight for the service elevator. The clock was ticking, and I was going hunting. I stripped off the custom-tailored tuxedo jacket and let it drop to the floor of the groom suite. It landed right next to the brass trash can, where the torn pieces of my financial execution now rested. I ripped the silk bow tie from my collar, unbuttoned the top of my crisp white shirt, and grabbed my leather wallet from the mahogany side table. Beatrice Sterling had given me a 3-hour head start, but I knew Harrison all too well. He was impatient, arrogant, and deeply paranoid. He would not wait the full 5 minutes before sending someone to check on me to ensure I was breaking under the pressure. I slipped out the heavy door and stepped into the quiet hallway. The distant sound of the pipe organ playing a joyful bridal chorus echoed from the main sanctuary. Hundreds of wealthy guests were taking their seats in the pews, adjusting their designer dresses and expensive suits, completely unaware that the groom was currently sprinting down the back corridor like a hunted fugitive. I pushed open the heavy metal door of the service elevator and hit the button for the underground parking garage. The mechanical descent felt agonizingly slow. My heart hammered against my ribs, keeping perfect frantic pace with the loud ticking of my grandmother's silver watch on my wrist. When the elevator doors finally slid open, the harsh smell of damp concrete and motor oil hit my senses. I ran past rows of luxury vehicles until I spotted the sleek black sedan parked in spot 12, exactly where Beatrice said it would be. I pulled the heavy ring of brass keys from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly from the adrenaline that I dropped them onto the concrete floor before finally unlocking the driver's side door. I threw myself into the premium leather seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and the powerful engine roared to life. I slammed the car into gear and sped toward the exit ramp, the tires squealing loudly against the polished concrete floor. The blinding morning sunlight hit my windshield as I merged onto the busy Boston streets, desperate to put as much physical distance as possible between myself and the massive stone cathedral. I had barely reached the highway on ramp when my cell phone erupted in the center console. The sudden sharp noise made me flinch violently. I glanced down at the bright screen. The caller ID flashed Harrison Sterling in bold block letters. I did not answer. I kept my foot pressed hard against the accelerator. 10 seconds later, the ringing stopped only to immediately start again. This time it was Caroline. My beautiful, brilliant bride. The woman I had promised to protect and cherish for the rest of my life. The woman who was actively trying to send me to a federal penitentiary to save her own skin. The phone vibrated violently against the plastic console, serving as a relentless physical manifestation of the trap rapidly closing around my life. I kept my eyes focused dead ahead on the road, merging into the fast lane, pushing the heavy sedan 10 miles past the speed limit. The ringing stopped again, followed instantly by the sharp chime of a new voicemail. Then another. Then a text message. The digital notifications poured in like rapid fire, a relentless psychological assault designed to break my nerve and force my submission. I reached down, connected the phone to the Bluetooth audio system of the sedan, and pressed play on the first voicemail. Harrison's voice filled the quiet cabin, bouncing off the expensive leather interior. He was no longer trying to sound composed or superior. He was absolutely furious. Declan, I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing, but you have exactly 2 minutes to get back into that suite and sign the document. If you think you can run away from this, you are completely delusional. I have eyes on every exit of this city. I know your boss at the accounting firm. I know the federal regulators. If you are not standing at that altar when the music starts, I will personally ensure that your auditing career is incinerated by noon. You will be facing embezzlement charges before you even reach your pathetic little apartment. Call me back right now. The message ended with a sharp, angry click. I let out a ragged breath. The arrogant billionaire was actually terrified because without my signature on that 60-page contract, he was holding a live grenade with the pin already pulled. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I was a senior financial auditor. My entire professional career was built on advanced pattern recognition, on seeing the hidden connections and financial irregularities that other people missed. But love is the ultimate blindfold. As I drove further away from the dense city skyline, the urban sprawl slowly giving way to the quiet tree-lined roads leading into the rural outskirts of the state, the memories of my relationship with Caroline began to flood my mind. I was not recalling our romantic vacations or our quiet dinners. I was analyzing the financial milestones of our relationship, the red flags that had been waving directly in my face for 2 years, the exact warning signs I had willingly ignored because I trusted her completely, suddenly aligned into a terrifyingly clear picture. I remembered a rainy Tuesday evening exactly 6 months into our relationship. We were sitting on the couch in my modest apartment eating cheap takeout when she casually suggested combining our primary bank accounts. She had framed it perfectly as a romantic gesture, a beautiful way of proving our absolute commitment to building a shared future. She had smiled that perfect, disarming smile, kissed my cheek, and said it would be so much easier if she just handled the daily financial transfers since she worked in real estate and managed portfolios all day. I was an auditor who spent 60 hours a week untangling massive corporate messes for ungrateful clients. I was constantly exhausted. The idea of letting someone else manage the mundane household finances felt like a massive relief. I handed her my passwords without a single second thought. I handed the brilliant architect of my destruction the absolute keys to my financial identity. A year later, she brought me a thick stack of legal papers to sign over breakfast. She claimed her family accountants had found a brilliant tax strategy for our future estate planning. She talked excitedly about establishing a limited liability company, a simple shell corporation designed to hold the deed to the historic house we were planning to buy after the wedding. It was a completely standard practice for high net worth families, she had explained smoothly, using all the correct legal jargon to put my professional mind at ease. She poured me a fresh cup of coffee, leaned over the granite table, and pointed perfectly manicured fingers to the signature lines. I had skimmed the documents, but I had not audited them. I had not looked for the trapdoor because you simply do not audit the woman you love. You do not treat your future wife like a hostile corporate entity trying to organize a hostile takeover. I signed the papers. I signed away my legal protection. Now, speeding down the empty rural highway, I realized that specific shell company was almost certainly the domestic anchor point for the fraudulent Cayman Island trust funds. She had been quietly building the legal framework to frame me for massive federal tax evasion while we were sitting in bed planning our honeymoon itinerary. The phone rang again, snapping me violently out of my dark memories. The digital screen displayed Caroline's name once more. I stared at it for a long time as the car tore down the road. My heart physically ached inside my chest. A small, pathetic part of me, the weak, hopeful part of the working-class suburban boy who just wanted a family of his own, desperately wanted to answer the phone and hear her tell me this was all a massive misunderstanding. I wanted her to cry, to tell me Harrison had gone completely crazy and she had absolutely no idea what was happening with the trust funds. But my analytical mind had already verified the brutal truth. Beatrice Sterling had warned me. Her own mother had risked the wrath of her son to tell me that Caroline had buried the truth once and was actively preparing to make me the next victim. I reached out and hit the green button to accept the call, leaving it on the loud car speakerphone, but I remained completely silent. Declan, Caroline said. Her voice was not frantic. It was not angry or tearful. It was terrifyingly calm, smooth, and perfectly measured. It was the distinct voice of a highly successful predator, realizing the chosen prey had somehow slipped out of the steel trap. "Where are you, sweetheart?" Harrison said you got a little overwhelmed by the guest list and needed some fresh air. "Everyone is waiting for you in the sanctuary. The guests are taking their seats right now. Please, just come back to the church. We can figure everything out together after the ceremony." I listened to the gentle, practiced cadence of her words. She was still playing the flawless role of the loving, concerned bride. She was still trying to manipulate my emotions using the affection she knew I held for her. "You read the contract, Caroline," I said, my voice sounding incredibly hollow and entirely unfamiliar in the quiet space of the car. "You knew exactly what Harrison put in that black folder. You were going to let me walk down that aisle, look you in the eyes, and sign a direct confession to federal financial crimes." There was a brief, loaded pause on the line. The silence stretched out, feeling heavy and thick with unsaid threats. When she finally spoke again, the gentle, loving bride was completely gone. Her tone dropped a full octave, turning cold, sharp, and brutally pragmatic. "You grew up with absolutely nothing, Declan. You have a small, insignificant life in a small, insignificant apartment. My family offered you the entire world. We gave you access to rooms and people you never would have seen in 10 lifetimes. All we asked in return was a little bit of loyalty, a little bit of cooperation to protect the people who elevated you from your mediocre existence. If you walk away right now, you are choosing to be destroyed. You do not have the financial resources to fight us. You do not have the money, the elite lawyers, or the political power. Come back to the church, sign the papers like a good man, and you get to live a life of absolute luxury. If you keep driving, I promise you will spend the next 20 years rotting in a federal penitentiary." She had dropped the mask entirely. There was no desperate denial. There was no tearful apology. She was openly admitting to the criminal conspiracy, confirming every single terrifying suspicion I had formed while standing in the groom suite. She viewed me exactly the way her brother Harrison did. I was merely an asset, a convenient tool to be used and swiftly discarded to balance their fraudulent spreadsheets and appease the federal investigators. I did not yell at her. I did not curse her name or demand answers. I simply reached over and pressed the red button on the screen, ending the call instantly. The heavy silence in the car rushed back in, broken only by the steady hum of the tires against the rough asphalt. My grandmother's written warning echoed loud and clear in my mind again. They do not buy love, they buy pawns. I pressed my foot much harder on the accelerator, watching the analog speedometer quickly climb past 80 miles an hour. The landscape outside the tinted window shifted rapidly from suburban housing developments to thick, overgrown pine forests and isolated stretches of empty road. The specific address Beatrice had written on the torn cardstock was pulling me much deeper into the rural isolation outside of Boston. My mind kept racing back to the complex financial structures Caroline had quietly put in place around my life. I was an expert auditor, and now I was finally auditing my own personal history. I realized every single argument we ever had about my career was a highly calculated move on her part. She had actively encouraged me to take on higher-profile auditing clients, pushing me to build my professional reputation as a strict, unyielding, and highly ethical financial investigator. I thought she was just proud of my ambition. I thought she genuinely wanted me to succeed in my field. But it was a brilliant setup. The federal authorities would never suspect a wealthy real estate dynasty of hiding millions of dollars if the person managing the offshore trust funds was a highly respected, fiercely independent corporate auditor. My spotless integrity was the perfect camouflage for their massive corruption. They were not just stealing my physical freedom, they were weaponizing my good name and my entire career to shield their criminal enterprise. The digital clock on the car dashboard read 10:15 in bright red numbers. The wedding ceremony was supposed to be starting in exactly 45 minutes. Back at the massive cathedral, the wealthy guests were probably shifting uncomfortably in their wooden seats, whispering to each other about the strangely delayed music. Harrison was probably tearing the historic building apart, shouting at the hired security guards, realizing his flawless legal plan was rapidly unraveling. The thought brought a grim, dark sense of satisfaction to my chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by the looming, dangerous mystery of my current destination. Beatrice had given me the heavy brass keys to uncover a secret much darker and much older than offshore tax evasion. She had specifically mentioned a buried truth. She had specifically mentioned the name St. Jude's Sanctuary. The GPS application on my phone directed me to turn sharply off the main highway onto a cracked, neglected two-lane asphalt road that was completely surrounded by incredibly dense, towering pine trees. The cell service bars on the digital screen immediately dropped to 0. I was entirely cut off from the outside world, driving through a green tunnel of heavy branches that blocked out the morning sun. I drove for another 10 tense miles, the rough road twisting and turning through the heavy timber until a massive wrought iron security gate suddenly appeared in the distance. The imposing structure looked entirely out of place in the middle of the quiet wilderness. It was flanked by incredibly high stone walls topped with modern security cameras and thick, menacing coils of razor wire. A small, highly discreet bronze plaque bolted firmly to the right stone pillar read, "St. Jude's Sanctuary," in elegant lettering. There were no friendly hospital signs, no welcoming banners, no medical transport vehicles, and absolutely no indication of what actually happened behind those fortified walls. It looked significantly less like a private medical facility, and much more like a high-security black site prison, a place strictly designed to keep people permanently trapped inside, rather than keep the public out. I pulled the black luxury sedan to a slow stop just outside the sweeping reach of the mounted security cameras. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly as I stared through the windshield at the forbidding iron gates. This was the exact place where the Sterling family buried their darkest mistakes. This was the exact place Beatrice had risked her own life and her family empire to send me. I reached deep into the pocket of my trousers and pulled out the heavy ring of old brass keys, tracing my thumb over the unique square head of the specific key Beatrice had urgently mentioned in the groom suite. The dashboard clock ticked forward to 10:30. The timeline was evaporating. My professional career, my personal freedom, and my entire future were hanging by a single incredibly fragile thread. But sitting in the shadow of that gate, I realized I was no longer running away in blind fear. The seasoned auditor inside me had taken absolute cold control of my mind. I was here to collect the hard evidence, uncover the buried truth of the Sterling family, and meticulously prepare the final devastating ledger. I reached forward, killed. The roaring engine slipped the heavy brass keys firmly into the palm of my hand and stepped out of the safety of the car into the cold, silent woods. The heavy iron gates of St. Jude's Sanctuary towered above my car like the entrance to a forgotten fortress. I killed the engine of the black luxury sedan and sat in the absolute silence of the dense pine forest. The building looked less like a medical facility and entirely like a maximum security prison designed to keep the world out. The dashboard clock glowed red, showing 10:30 in the morning. Back in the city, 500 of the wealthiest people in New England were shifting in their wooden pews at the cathedral, waiting for a wedding that was rapidly turning into a crime scene. I gripped the heavy ring of brass keys Beatrice Sterling had pressed into my sweating palm. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind again. They do not buy love, they buy pawns. I was about to find out exactly what happens to the pawns when the Sterling family no longer needs them. I stepped out of the vehicle and the freezing morning air hit my face like a physical blow. The wind howled through the thick branches, masking the sound of my footsteps as I approached the massive stone pillar holding the security keypad. Beatrice had told me to use the square-headed brass key. I slid it into the hidden mechanical lock beneath the digital pad and turned it sharply to the right. The heavy iron gates shuddered, groaning against their rusted hinges before slowly swinging open just wide enough for me to slip through. I did not drive the car inside. I needed to remain completely invisible. I walked up the winding asphalt driveway, my expensive leather dress shoes crunching softly against the loose gravel. The main building of the sanctuary was a sprawling, brutalist concrete structure completely devoid of windows on the ground floor. It felt entirely unnatural, a place completely stripped of humanity and warmth. I followed the high brick wall around the perimeter until I found the side security door Beatrice had mentioned. It was a heavy steel barrier painted a dull, lifeless gray. I fumbled with the ring of keys, my hands shaking from a massive surge of adrenaline. I tried 3 different keys before the 4th one finally caught the tumblers. The lock disengaged with a loud, hollow click that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. I pulled the heavy door open and stepped into the suffocating belly of the beast. The contrast between the luxurious groom suite I had left behind and the corridor I now stood in was completely jarring. The air inside St. Jude's sanctuary smelled strongly of industrial bleach rubbing alcohol and the distinct tragic scent of forgotten people. The hallway was painted a pale, sickly green, illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, annoying frequency. I stood perfectly still for a long moment, listening intently for any signs of movement. Far down the corridor, I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a television playing a morning talk show and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes moving away from me. I waited until the footsteps faded into absolute silence before I began to move. My professional training as a senior financial auditor relies heavily on observing details that other people actively ignore. As I walked down the sterile hallway, my eyes rapidly scanned the environment. There were no decorative paintings on the walls. There were no comfortable chairs for visitors. There were no names listed on the heavy metal doors, only large stenciled black numbers. This place was not designed to heal anyone. It was a highly secure storage facility for human beings. It was an incredibly expensive vault where wealthy families paid massive amounts of money to bury their living mistakes. I passed room number 8, then room number 10. The tension in my chest tightened with every single step. Room 12. Room 13. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I stopped directly in front of the door marked with a bold black 14. This was it. This was the epicenter of the Sterling family empire of lies. This was the buried truth Beatrice had risked her entire life to reveal to me. I looked down at the brass keyring. There was only one key left that I had not used. It was slightly smaller than the others, tarnished and worn smooth along the edges from years of use. I inserted it into the heavy deadbolt of room 14. My hand was trembling so severely that the metal rattled loudly against the lock. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and turned the key. The lock opened heavily. I pushed the door inward and stepped into the dim, heavily shadowed room. The heavy curtains were drawn completely shut, blocking out the morning sunlight. The only illumination came from a small, low wattage lamp resting on a bedside table. The room was sparsely furnished. There was a narrow hospital-grade bed with pristine white sheets, a small dresser, and a metal medical cart holding various plastic cups and sealed syringes. But my eyes were immediately drawn to the far corner of the room. Sitting in a heavy motorized wheelchair facing the closed curtains was a man. I was incredibly frail, his body swallowed by the oversized gray sweatpants and loose cotton shirt he was wearing. His shoulders were slumped forward in a posture of total absolute defeat. An intravenous line was taped securely to the back of his pale, translucent hand, feeding a clear liquid into his veins. He did not react to the sound of the door opening. He did not turn his head or acknowledge my presence in any way. He just sat there perfectly still, staring blankly at the heavy fabric covering the window. I took a slow, hesitant step forward. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my weight. "Hello," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly loud and harsh in the suffocating quiet of the room. The man in the wheelchair slowly turned his head toward the sound of my voice. The movement was sluggish, heavily delayed, indicating he was heavily sedated. When the dim light from the bedside lamp finally illuminated his face, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. I stumbled backward, my shoulders hitting the heavy wooden door behind me. My mind violently rejected the visual information my eyes were processing. It was completely impossible. It defied every single law of reality, every piece of documented history, and every tear my future wife had ever cried in my presence. I recognized the face. I knew exactly who this man was because I had stared at his photograph 100 times. I had stood next to Caroline in the historic Boston cemetery, holding her hand, while she laid expensive white roses on top of his engraved marble headstone. It was Thomas Vance. Caroline Sterling had been married once before she met me. Thomas Vance was a highly successful maritime architect, a brilliant and wealthy man who had fallen desperately in love with the heiress of the Sterling real estate empire. 5 years ago, their massive luxury sailboat had capsized during a violent, unpredictable storm off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Caroline had miraculously survived clinging to a piece of floating debris until the Coast Guard rescue helicopters arrived. Thomas was completely lost to the freezing ocean. His body was never recovered. The authorities dragged the ocean floor for weeks, but they found absolutely nothing. After a mandatory waiting period, a federal judge officially declared him legally dead. I remembered the late nights Caroline had spent crying against my chest, telling me how much she missed him, how the trauma of that night still haunted her dreams. I had held her, comforted her, and promised her that I would spend the rest of my life making her feel safe again. She had played the role of the tragic grieving widow with absolute terrifying perfection. But Thomas Vance was not dead. He was sitting less than 10 feet away from me in a heavily secured room, heavily drugged and completely isolated from the outside world. "Thomas," I breathed, pushing myself away from the door and taking another cautious step toward the wheelchair. My mind was spinning wildly, trying to bridge the massive gap between the lie I had been sold and the horrifying truth sitting in front of me. "Thomas, can you hear me? Do you know who I am?" His eyes were a faded, cloudy blue. They wandered aimlessly across my face for a long moment before slowly coming into focus. His lips were dry and cracked. He opened his mouth, struggling to form a sound against the heavy weight of the medical sedatives flowing through his bloodstream. "You are not Harrison," he whispered. His voice was incredibly weak, completely raspy from years of disuse. "No, I am not Harrison," I said, kneeling down on the cold linoleum floor so I was at eye level with him. "My name is Declan Hayes. I am an auditor. I am supposed to be marrying Caroline today." The mention of Caroline's name sent a violent, visible shudder through his frail body. His cloudy eyes suddenly widened with raw, unfiltered terror. A sudden spark of frantic clarity broke through the chemical fog in his brain. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the sleeve of my white dress shirt. His grip was surprisingly desperate. "You have to run," Thomas gasped, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You have to get away from them. They will bury you. They will take your name, they will take your life, and they will bury you in the dark." My analytical mind, the cold and calculating side of my brain that evaluated corporate ledgers, finally snapped the remaining pieces of the puzzle together. The $20 million life insurance payout. When Thomas was declared legally dead 5 years ago, Caroline became the sole beneficiary of his massive life insurance policy. It was a staggering $20 million in tax-free liquid capital. I had seen the original financial transfer documents during my own auditing of her domestic accounts when we first moved in together. She had claimed she wanted to invest the money into charitable foundations to honor his memory. But I had seen the offshore trust fund structures in the black leather folder Harrison had forced upon me just an hour ago. The $20 million never went to charity. It was the seed money. It was the foundational capital Harrison and Caroline used to establish the fraudulent Cayman Island trusts. They had used the massive influx of insurance money to build the complex web of shell companies funneling untaxed real estate profits overseas and hiding it from the federal government. The entire Sterling family financial empire was currently propped up by $20 million of stolen blood money. But to get the money, they needed Thomas to die. Except they could not actually murder him. Thomas Vance was a high-profile public figure with a massive family of his own. A murdered husband invites relentless police investigations, autopsy reports, and federal scrutiny. A tragic boating accident with a lost body, however, invites nothing but public sympathy and an expedited insurance payout. They had faked the accident. They had somehow orchestrated the storm narrative, pulled Thomas out of the water, and smuggled him into this private black site facility. They had stripped him of his identity, his wealth, and his freedom, locking him in room 14 under a false name, keeping him heavily sedated so he could never escape or reach out for help. The sheer incomprehensible evil of the plan struck me with the force of a physical blow. I was not just dealing with greedy corporate executives trying to dodge taxes. I was dealing with absolute monsters. Harrison and Caroline had looked a man in the eyes, a man who loved her, and casually erased him from the face of the earth to balance their financial ledgers. And now, 5 years later, the Internal Revenue Service was finally closing in on the offshore accounts. The federal regulators were asking questions about the missing $20 million and the phantom shell companies. The Sterlings were panicking. They needed a new firewall. They needed a new scapegoat to take the fall for the massive financial fraud they had built on top of Thomas Vance's stolen life. That is why they needed me. I was the perfect replacement. A senior financial auditor with a spotless reputation. By forcing me to sign that prenuptial agreement this morning, they were legally transferring the ownership of the fraudulent trusts into my name. They were going to hand the federal investigators a perfectly packaged narrative. They would claim that the greedy new son-in-law had secretly hijacked the family finances and embezzled the money. I would go to federal prison for the rest of my life, and the Sterlings would walk away completely clean, keeping the millions they had stolen. My mother warned me, Thomas whispered, interrupting my terrifying realization. His cloudy eyes filled with heavy, unwept tears. She told me Caroline was a void. She told me the Sterlings do not love people, they consume them. I did not listen. I loved her too much. I signed the papers. I got on the boat. I looked down at the trembling man in the wheelchair. He was looking at me, but I knew he was really looking at a mirror of his own past. We were the exact same victim, separated only by 5 years and a few $1 million. We were both working-class men who had been blinded by the glamorous illusion of the Sterling dynasty. We had both ignored the warning signs because we believed love could conquer their arrogance. We had both been led to the slaughterhouse by the woman we promised to protect. My grandmother's letter burned brightly in my memory again. They do not buy love, they buy pawns. I placed my hand gently over Thomas's trembling fingers. The fear that had been gripping my chest all morning entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I was an auditor. I spent my life exposing lies, uncovering hidden truths, and ensuring that the ledgers were perfectly balanced. The Sterling family had built an empire on top of stolen money and a buried man, and they were about to use my good name to protect it. I am going to get you out of here, Thomas, I said, my voice dropping to a low, absolute whisper of determination. I am going to expose every single thing they have done to you. Thomas weakly shook his head, slumping further back into the heavy wheelchair. You cannot fight them. They own the police. They own the judges. Harrison has the contract. If you do not sign it, he will destroy your life anyway. He already tried, I replied, standing up and pulling my smartphone from the pocket of my trousers. But he made a massive miscalculation. He thought I was just a pawn. He did not realize he was inviting the executioner into his own house. I looked at the digital clock on the phone screen. I had exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes before the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. 1 hour and 15 minutes before Caroline Sterling walked down the grand aisle in her white designer dress, expecting to find her perfectly framed scapegoat waiting at the altar. I opened the camera application on my phone and started taking high-resolution photographs. I photographed the room, the medical equipment, the sedation labels on the intravenous bags, and finally the frail, tragic face of Thomas Vance. The conflict had shifted from a desperate flight for survival into a highly calculated offensive strike. The Sterlings had hidden their greatest sin behind a locked door, and I was about to broadcast it to the entire world. I stood in the dim light of room 14, my mind racing faster than it ever had in my entire professional life. The frail, sedated man sitting in the wheelchair in front of me was not a hallucination, and he was certainly not a ghost. I was the foundational capital of a massive criminal enterprise. I looked at Thomas Vance, a man officially declared dead by a federal judge 5 years ago, and suddenly the chaotic, terrifying pieces of the Sterling family puzzle locked together with absolute precision. My training as a senior financial auditor took total control of my rising panic. I did not just see a tragic victim trapped in a black site medical facility. I saw a walking $20 million liability. 5 years ago, Caroline collected an enormous life insurance payout after Thomas supposedly drowned in a horrific boating accident. I had seen the initial domestic transfer documents when we first moved in together. But that money never went to the charitable foundations she tearfully claimed to support, and it certainly never sat quietly in a standard domestic savings account. That $20 million was the exact seed money used to open the 3 Cayman Island trust funds listed in the fraudulent prenuptial agreement Harrison had thrown at me this morning. I began pacing the length of the small linoleum floor, speaking my thoughts aloud as the horrifying mechanics of their scheme became completely undeniable. They took the massive insurance payout and immediately funneled it offshore. Then over the past 5 years, they used those specific Cayman accounts to wash untaxed capital gains from the domestic Sterling real estate empire, cycling tens of millions of dollars through phantom consulting firms and anonymous shell companies. It was a textbook round-trip tax evasion structure executed on a breathtaking scale, but it was entirely built on top of a faked death. And you cannot maintain a faked death forever without eventually leaving a fatal paper trail. The Internal Revenue Service does not just ignore $20 million moving across international borders. The federal agents had to be closing in. They must have finally flagged the offshore accounts, identified the phantom holding companies, and started asking aggressive questions. Harrison and Caroline were panicking. They needed a firewall immediately. They needed a highly credible, financially literate scapegoat to take the absolute fall before the federal indictments came crashing down on their heads. They chose me. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the sterile walls of the medical room. I was the absolute perfect target. A respected corporate auditor with a spotless professional record and no inherited wealth to afford a massive legal defense. If the federal authorities raided the Sterling corporate offices next week, Harrison would simply open his safe and hand them the signed prenuptial agreement. That 60-page document legally bound me as the sole managing director of those exact offshore trusts. The Sterlings were going to tell the world that their greedy new husband had secretly hijacked the family finances, embezzled millions to feed his own ego, and orchestrated the massive tax fraud entirely on his own. I would go to federal prison for 20 years, and Caroline would play the tragic betrayed wife for a second time. She would keep her freedom, keep the stolen millions, and simply erase my existence the exact same way she had erased Thomas. Thomas shifted weakly in his motorized wheelchair, the heavy sedatives making his head nod forward against his chest. "You have to leave, Declan," he whispered, his voice incredibly dry and raspy from years of disuse. "If Harrison finds out you are standing in this room, they will never let you leave. They will lock you in a cell just like this one, or they will kill you for real. You cannot fight their kind of money. Just run. Run as far away as you can before the ceremony starts." I looked down at the broken man. A few hours ago, I might have taken that desperate advice. A few hours ago, standing in the luxurious groom suite surrounded by imported silk and gold leaf, I had been completely terrified of Harrison Sterling and his army of corporate lawyers. I had felt entirely powerless, a working-class pawn about to be crushed by a billionaire dynasty. But looking at the horrifying reality sitting in front of me changed absolutely everything. I felt a cold, heavily calculated rage settle deep inside my chest, It rapidly replaced every ounce of fear, every ounce of heartbreak, and every single lingering shred of love I had ever held for Caroline. I was not going to run away. I was an auditor. I spent my entire adult career hunting down corporate monsters, believed their wealth made them untouchable. The Sterlings had made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They brought an expert financial investigator directly into their active crime scene and casually handed him the map. "I am not running anywhere, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a low, absolute tone of determination. "I am going to burn their entire empire to the absolute ground, and I am going to walk you out of those front gates today." I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and began moving rapidly around the small, heavily shadowed room. The time for panic was completely over. It was time to aggressively collect the evidence. I opened my camera application and started taking high-resolution photographs of every single detail. I photographed the heavy iron security bars bolted to the outside of the window. I photographed the heavy deadbolt on the door. I took clear, sharply focused pictures of the intravenous bags hanging from the metal medical stand, making sure to capture the exact pharmaceutical labels showing the heavy chemical sedatives they were actively pumping into his veins. I walked over to the small metal desk tucked into the far corner of the room. A thick manila folder rested on top of it, clearly left behind by a careless facility nurse. I flipped the heavy cover open. It was a comprehensive daily medical chart, but the name printed at the top of the page did not say Thomas Vance. It read, Patient 874. I quickly scanned the daily nursing logs. The pages detailed a horrifying systematic regimen of chemical restraints, physical isolation protocols, and psychological suppression designed to keep a human being completely docile. But my trained eyes instantly caught the specific financial billing code printed at the bottom right corner of every single page. It was a 9-digit routing number I recognized immediately. It was the exact same domestic shell company listed in the appendix of the fraudulent prenuptial agreement sitting in the trash can back at the cathedral. The Sterlings were paying this black site medical facility $50,000 a month to keep Thomas permanently sedated and hidden, and they were using the laundered offshore money to fund his captivity. I photographed every single page of that medical file. My hands were perfectly steady, driven by pure adrenaline and professional focus. The digital camera shutter clicked rapidly in the quiet room, capturing the undeniable hard proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. I turned back to Thomas and took a close-up photograph of his face, ensuring his specific facial features were completely unmistakable, despite the extreme weight loss and the pale, translucent skin. Then I photographed a highly unique crescent-shaped birthmark on his left forearm, a distinct physical detail I vividly remembered. Caroline mentioning once when she was expertly playing the role of the grieving widow at a dinner party. The accumulated evidence was absolutely irrefutable. This was not a random psychiatric patient. This was the legally dead husband of a woman who was currently putting on a white dress to marry me. I had the clear financial motive. I had the specific routing records connecting the trusts to the facility. I had the physical proof of the kidnapped victim, but I knew with absolute certainty that I could not just walk into a local Boston police station with this explosive information. The Sterling family practically owned the local municipal authorities. Harrison frequently bragged at family dinners about heavily funding the political campaigns of the district attorney and the chief of police. If I handed this file over to a regular detective, the evidence would mysteriously disappear by midnight, and I would be quickly arrested for criminal trespassing and corporate espionage. I needed someone entirely outside of their corrupt jurisdiction. I needed someone completely immune to their massive wealth. I needed top-level federal authority, and I needed it right this second. I rapidly scrolled through the contact list on my phone until I found the name of a man I had worked with 5 years ago, Agent Gregory Miller. Greg and I had spent 6 grueling months locked in a windowless conference room, tearing apart a massive corporate Ponzi scheme that had defrauded thousands of pensioners. He was a brilliant forensic accountant who had joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation specifically to hunt down arrogant white-collar criminals. He was ruthless, highly intelligent, and absolutely hated billionaires who thought they could casually buy their way out of a federal indictment. I hit the call button and pressed the cold phone hard against my ear, listening to the agonizing sound of the digital ringing tone. The digital dashboard clock on my phone screen read 11 in the morning. I had exactly 1 hour before the grand wedding ceremony was officially scheduled to begin. 1 hour before Caroline walked down that long aisle expecting me to be standing there completely broken, terrified, and ready to sign my life away. The line clicked open. Declan Hayes, a deep, gravelly voice, answered on the other end, sounding slightly amused. "I thought you were getting married today. Do not tell me you are calling to ask for emergency tax advice on your wedding day. Greg, I need you to drop whatever you are doing and listen to me very carefully," I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly urgent. "I am not calling about taxes. I am currently standing inside a highly secure private medical facility 40 miles outside of the city limits. I am looking directly at a man named Thomas Vance." There was a sharp, heavy silence on the line. I could clearly hear the sound of Greg abruptly shifting in his leather office chair, the casual, joking tone completely vanishing from his voice. "Thomas Vance has been legally dead for 5 years, Declan. His wife collected a $20 million life insurance policy after a boating accident. That case is completely closed. His wife is my fiancée, Greg." I replied, my words cold, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. "And Thomas is not dead. He is sitting in a wheelchair right in front of me, heavily sedated with illegal chemical restraints. The Sterlings completely faked his death to claim the insurance money. They used that exact payout to capitalize 3 massive offshore trust funds in the Cayman Islands. They have been running a massive corporate tax evasion ring for half a decade. The Internal Revenue Service is actively auditing them right now, and Harrison Sterling just tried to force me to sign a highly modified prenuptial agreement, assuming total legal liability for those specific accounts under extreme duress. They are trying to frame me for the entire federal crime to save their own empire." I heard the rapid, aggressive sound of fingers hitting a computer keyboard on the other end of the line. Greg was already pulling up the Sterling family corporate files. He did not question my sanity for a single second. He knew my flawless reputation as an auditor. He knew I did not make wild accusations without hard, undeniable data to back them up. "Do you have hard proof?" "Declan," Greg demanded, his voice dropping into full tactical mode. "If we move on the Sterling family, we need an absolutely airtight case. They have the most expensive, aggressive legal defense team on the entire East Coast. If we miss by an inch, they will bury both of us in counter lawsuits for the next decade." "I have absolutely everything," I confirmed, staring at the photographed documents glowing brightly on my phone screen. "I have the specific billing routing numbers linking the Sterling shell companies directly to this illegal black site facility. I have the nursing medical charts showing the continuous chemical sedation protocols. I have high-resolution photographs of Thomas Vance sitting alive in room 14. I am sending the entire data package to your encrypted federal email address right this second." I hit the send button on the massive batch of image files. I watched the blue progress bar inch slowly across the screen, holding my breath until the green confirmation checkmark finally appeared. The explosive data was officially out of the room. It was completely out of the Sterling's control. The digital bomb had been planted directly on the desk of a federal agent. "Got it," Greg said a moment later, his breath catching slightly. "I can see the photos. Declan, this is absolutely massive. We have been trying to crack the Sterling real estate portfolio for 3 solid years, but they always kept the ledgers too clean. This is the ultimate smoking gun. Where are you right now? Give me the exact physical address of that facility." I quickly read off the rural street address Beatrice had given me on the torn cardstock. Greg typed furiously. "I am dispatching a federal tactical medical team to that location right now. We are going to secure Thomas, lock down the entire facility, and arrest the medical staff. But Declan, you are in extreme physical danger. If Harrison Sterling realizes you know about this, he will not hesitate to silence you permanently. You need to stay exactly where you are. Lock that door, and wait for my armed agents to arrive. Do not go back to that church under any circumstances." I looked back down at Thomas. He was watching me with wide, terrified eyes, slowly beginning to understand that the living nightmare he had endured for 5 years might actually be ending today. Then I thought about Caroline. I thought about the woman standing in a custom designer gown, smiling for the cameras, accepting the warm congratulations of high society, while actively planning to send me to a concrete federal cell. I thought about the hundreds of wealthy elites sitting in the beautiful cathedral, completely oblivious to the monstrous, violent reality, funding their expensive champagne reception. "No, Greg," I said, my voice hardening into absolute steel. "I am not hiding in a hospital room while they confidently celebrate their perfect crime. If I do not show up at that altar, Harrison will immediately know his trap failed. He will activate his corporate contingency plans, instantly drain the offshore accounts, and shred the domestic documents hidden in the groom suite before you even get a search warrant signed by a federal judge. I have to go back. I have to keep them completely distracted and arrogant until the last possible second." "Declan, that is a literal suicide mission," Greg argued, his tone rising with genuine desperate concern. "You walk back into that cathedral and you are entirely surrounded by their private security team, their lawyers, and their powerful allies. You do not have any backup." "I do not need backup to read a ledger," I replied fiercely. "I need you to get your tactical teams to the cathedral. Give me exactly 45 minutes. Let them get comfortable. Let them truly think they have completely won the game. Let Caroline walk down that long aisle. I am going to stand at that altar, and I am going to tear their entire financial empire to shreds in front of every single person they have ever tried to impress. When I give the signal, you kick the cathedral doors in and you arrest them all." Greg was silent for a long, heavy moment. He knew he could not physically stop me, and he knew my strategic logic was perfectly sound. Catching them by total surprise at the altar was the only way to ensure Harrison did not destroy the financial evidence. "Fine," Greg finally said, his voice grim. 45 minutes. Do not do anything stupid, Declan. I will have 20 armed federal agents surrounding that church." I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The lingering fear was completely gone, entirely burned away by the sheer magnitude of what I was about to do. I turned back to Thomas Vance. He was crying silently, tears tracking down his pale, gaunt cheeks. "They are coming for you, Thomas," I said, placing my hand gently on his thin shoulder. "Federal agents are on their way right now. They are bringing doctors. They are going to take you to a real hospital, and you are going to get your entire life back. You just have to hold on for a little bit longer." Thomas reached up with a trembling hand and gripped my wrist. His physical grip was incredibly weak, but the emotion behind it was overwhelming. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "Please be careful with her. She looks exactly like an angel, but she has the heart of an absolute demon." "I know exactly what she is now," I replied coldly. I turned and walked out of room 14, pulling the heavy metal door shut behind me and locking it securely with the brass key. I sprinted back down the sterile green hallway, bypassing the security doors and bursting out into the crisp, freezing Boston morning air. I reached the black sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the engine into gear. The tires spun aggressively on the loose gravel as I tore away from the forbidding iron gates of the sanctuary. The dashboard clock read 11:15. I had 45 minutes to get back to the Trinity Cathedral. 45 minutes to return to my own planned execution, not as the pathetic scapegoat they designed me to be, but as the absolute architect of their ultimate destruction. The auditor was coming back to permanently close the accounts. The massive iron bells of the Trinity Cathedral began to toll. The heavy rhythmic chiming sent deep vibrations through the cold Boston air, announcing to the entire city that the highly anticipated Sterling wedding was officially beginning. I parked the black luxury sedan half a block away from the cathedral entrance, completely ignoring the frantic valet stand and the long line of idling limousines. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for one final moment. The digital dashboard clock read exactly 12 noon. My 45 minutes were up. I looked down at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was completely stripped of the perfect groom persona they had so carefully constructed for me. I was no longer wearing the custom-tailored tuxedo jacket that cost more than my first car. My silk bow tie was gone, likely swept up by the cleaning staff back in the groom suite. The top 3 buttons of my crisp white dress shirt were undone, and the expensive fabric was slightly wrinkled from my chaotic sprint through the underground parking garage and the damp corridors of the medical facility. But strapped securely to my left wrist was the cheap, scratched silver watch my grandmother had given me. It ticked with a steady, reliable rhythm, a constant reminder of who I truly was. I reached into the pocket of my trousers and felt the thick, heavy shape of my smartphone. It held the digital photographs, the copied medical charts, the undeniable proof of Thomas Vance sitting alive in room 14. The evidence was secured. The federal agents were on their way. The bomb was perfectly primed. I opened the car door and stepped out into the blinding midday sun, the cold wind hitting my face and sharpening my focus. I walked toward the towering stone facade of the cathedral with slow, highly deliberate steps. I was no longer the panicked, cornered animal Harrison Sterling had left in the groom suite an hour ago. I was a man walking directly toward an execution, but I was fully aware that I was the one holding the axe. The heavy wooden doors of the main sanctuary were closed shut, heavily guarded by 2 private security men wearing dark suits and earpieces. They looked at me with immediate, visible confusion. They recognized my face from the rehearsal dinner the night before, but my highly disheveled appearance instantly triggered their professional alarms. One of the guards took a step forward, raising a hand to stop me while his partner reached for the radio clipped to his belt. They were likely preparing to alert Harrison that the groom had finally arrived, but looking like he had just survived a violent car crash. I did not give them the opportunity to speak or broadcast a warning. I did not slow down my pace. I walked straight past their outstretched hands, pushed both of my palms flat against the towering oak doors, and shoved them wide open with every single ounce of physical strength I possessed. The massive doors swung inward with a loud echoing groan that cut directly through the joyful swelling music of the grand pipe organ. The sudden violent noise was like a cannon firing inside a library. 500 of the most powerful, wealthy people in New England were packed tightly into the polished wooden pews. They were heavily adorned in diamonds, imported silk, and designer suits, creating a massive sea of glittering high society perfection. The cathedral itself was breathtakingly opulent, decorated with thousands of white roses, cascading green vines, and towering pillars of warm candlelight. But the exact moment the heavy doors hit the stone walls, the grand music abruptly stopped. The organist was so startled that his hands slipped off the keys, producing a harsh, discordant screech that hung awkwardly in the massive vaulted space. 500 heads turned simultaneously to look at the back of the church. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like a sudden rush of wind. I stood perfectly framed in the doorway, completely silhouetted by the bright sunlight streaming in from the street behind me. The silence that rushed into the cathedral was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was not the reverent, breathless silence of a wedding crowd waiting eagerly for a beautiful bride. It was the shocked, deeply uncomfortable silence of a crowd witnessing something entirely wrong. I completely ignored the gasps, the pointing fingers, and the confused whispering that was beginning to ripple rapidly through the back rows. My eyes locked immediately onto the grand altar at the far end of the long center aisle. I took my first step forward. My leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet church, establishing a slow, terrifying rhythm. I did not rush. I forced my pace to slow down to a breathtaking, agonizing degree. I wanted them to feel the heavy weight of every single passing second. As I walked past the wooden pews, the wealthy guests physically leaned away from me, pulling their expensive gowns and tailored jackets out of my path, as if my poverty or my anger might be contagious. I could hear their frantic, hushed voices buzzing around me like a hive of angry insects. They were whispering harsh judgments about my missing jacket, my wrinkled shirt, my obvious lack of respect for the grand Sterling family tradition. They were judging the poor working-class boy from the suburbs who clearly did not know how to behave in polite society. But their shallow judgments meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I was actively auditing the entire room, and I found every single one of them entirely bankrupt. I thought about the frail, sedated man sitting in a wheelchair 40 miles away. I thought about the millions of dollars surrounding me right now, the expensive floral arrangements and the glittering jewelry, all of it funded by a massive criminal enterprise and a stolen life. The contrast was absolutely sickening. Caroline Sterling was already standing at the front of the altar. She looked absolutely radiant, a flawless vision of innocence and grace wrapped in a magnificent custom-designed white wedding dress that cost more than most people earned in a decade. Diamonds glittered brightly at her throat and in her perfectly styled blonde hair. She was playing the role of the blushing, devoted bride with terrifying, practiced perfection. Standing just a few feet away from her on the elevated platform was her brother Harrison. He stood incredibly tall, his shoulders squared proudly, his custom suit immaculate. When he first saw me standing at the back of the church, a smug, deeply triumphant smirk spread across his face. He saw my missing jacket and my unbuttoned shirt, and his arrogant mind clearly assumed the absolute worst. He believed the psychological pressure had completely broken me. He believed I had suffered a massive panic attack in the groom suite, finally surrendered to my own weakness, and signed the fraudulent 60-page contract before stumbling out here to accept my fate as their permanent scapegoat. He looked at me with the absolute certainty of a predator who had successfully driven his exhausted prey into an inescapable corner. I kept my gaze fixed dead ahead as I continued my slow march. The distance between the doors and the altar felt like a mile, but I used the long walk to build the psychological pressure to an explosive level. I stared directly into Harrison's eyes. I watched the progression of his thoughts play out across his face. At first his smirk held steady, but as I drew closer, passing the halfway mark of the aisle, he noticed something was wrong. He noticed my rigid posture. I was not walking with the slumped shoulders of a defeated man. My hands were not trembling. My eyes were not filled with tears or terror. My gaze was completely cold, sharp, and deeply calculated. I was looking at him the exact same way I looked at a corrupt corporate ledger right before I handed the devastating evidence over to federal regulators. The smug satisfaction on Harrison's face began to crack, replaced by a tiny, microscopic flicker of genuine confusion and rising panic. I moved my eyes away from him and looked directly at Caroline. She was clutching a massive bouquet of white flowers so tightly that her knuckles were turning pale. Her perfect, glowing smile had frozen into a tight, strained expression. Just a few hours ago, looking at her would have broken my heart. I would have felt the crushing weight of betrayal. But standing in room 14 of that medical facility had burned away every last trace of my naive affection. Looking at her now, I did not see a beautiful bride. I saw a hollow, terrifying void. I saw a monster wrapped in white silk. I saw a woman who could kiss a man, tell him she loved him, and then casually help fake his death to collect a $20 million insurance payout. I saw a woman who could sleep beside me for 2 years while actively building a federal tax evasion trap designed to send me to prison for the rest of my life. Her beauty was nothing but a highly expensive mask, and I was about to rip it off in front of the entire world. As I took another slow step toward the altar, my grandmother's advice echoed loudly and clearly in my mind. She had always told me that true strength does not lie in money, but in daring to face the truth. The Sterlings had spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a massive empire of lies. They bought mansions, they bought politicians, and they bought private medical facilities to keep their darkest secrets buried in the dark. They truly believed their vast wealth made them completely immune to the consequences of reality. But my grandmother had scrubbed floors her entire life, and she possessed more genuine strength in her little finger than this entire family held in their offshore bank accounts. She had warned me that they do not buy love, they buy pawns. I was supposed to be the pawn they sacrificed today to protect their king. But they forgot that if a pawn makes it all the way to the end of the board, it has the power to change the entire game. I felt the immense power of that truth settling deep into my bones, completely replacing any lingering fear I had of their wealth or their social standing. I reached the front row of the pews. Beatrice Sterling was sitting there gripping the wooden railing with shaking hands. I did not look directly at her, but I could feel the desperate, terrified hope radiating from her rigid posture. She knew exactly where I had been. She knew exactly what I had seen. I climbed the 3 short marble steps leading up to the elevated platform. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from Caroline and Harrison. The physical proximity was suffocating. I could see a single drop of cold sweat slowly tracing its way down the side of Harrison's face. The priest standing behind the pulpit looked absolutely terrified, his eyes darting back and forth between us, completely unsure of how to proceed with the ruined ceremony. Harrison tried to lean in, attempting to intimidate me with his size, his voice dropping into a harsh, frantic whisper meant only for my ears. "Where is your jacket, Declan?" he hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the bewildered crowd and then back to my face. "Did you sign the document in the suite? Tell me you signed the document right now, or I swear I will destroy your life before you take another breath." I did not answer him. I did not even blink. I just stared at him, letting the absolute silence stretch out, letting his own paranoia and rising terror strangle him. I was a senior financial auditor. I knew that when you finally corner a massive fraud, you do not need to shout or throw punches. You simply present the hard data and watch their entire world collapse. I stood perfectly still on the altar, surrounded by the blinding lights and the suffocating scent of white roses, feeling the heavy shape of my phone resting in my pocket. The trap they had spent years building was currently sitting in a brass trash can, torn into 100 useless pieces. The ghost they had buried alive was currently being rescued by armed federal agents, and the obedient, terrified scapegoat they were expecting to manipulate was entirely gone. I looked deep into the eyes of the monsters who had tried to consume my life, waiting for the exact right moment to strike the final, devastating blow. The elderly priest stood behind the massive marble pulpit of the Trinity Cathedral. He looked absolutely terrified. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the silk collar of his vestments. He had married dozens of wealthy couples in this exact spot, but he clearly sensed the violent, invisible war currently raging on the elevated platform. The thick silence in the sanctuary was suffocating. 500 elite guests sat perfectly still in the wooden pews, holding their collective breath. I stood exactly 3 feet away from Caroline and Harrison. My unbuttoned white shirt and missing tuxedo jacket stood in sharp, jarring contrast to the millions of dollars worth of floral arrangements and glowing candlelight surrounding us. Harrison glared at me with absolute venom, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He was waiting for me to break. I was waiting for the poor boy from the suburbs to surrender to the crushing pressure of the Sterling dynasty. Caroline reached out and gently placed her hand on my arm. Her touch, which used to bring me immense comfort, now felt like a venomous snake resting against my skin. She smiled for the hundreds of cameras and watchful eyes, but her voice dropped into a sharp, quiet whisper, meant only for me. "Stop this right now, Declan." She breathed, her perfectly painted lips barely moving. "You are making a massive scene. Sign the papers after the ceremony and I promise everything will be perfect. We can still have our beautiful life. Just play your part and smile." I looked down at her hand resting on my sleeve. I felt completely detached from her. The love I had carried for this woman for 2 years had been entirely incinerated in the dark, damp basement of a medical facility 40 miles away. I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked back up at the priest and offered a short, firm nod. The priest swallowed hard, wiped a bead of sweat from his wrinkled forehead, and nervously opened his leather-bound ceremonial book. "Dearly beloved the priest," began his voice, echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system and bouncing off the high-vaulted ceilings of the cathedral. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God and the presence of these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over the crowd. I listened to the familiar cadence of the wedding script, analyzing it with the cold, calculated precision of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. The entire ceremony was a massive, expensive lie. The holy vows were nothing but a legal mechanism designed to transfer offshore criminal liability onto my shoulders. The beautiful white dress Caroline wore was a calculated costume meant to project innocence while she actively planned to bury me alive in a federal prison. I stood perfectly still, letting the priest continue his speech. I needed the tension to stretch. I needed Harrison and Caroline to believe their trap was actually going to work. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their arrogant confidence before I tore their entire world apart. Marriage is an honorable estate. The priest continued, his voice gaining a slight bit of confidence as the familiar rhythm of the ceremony took over. It is not to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly, but reverently, discreetly, and soberly. Harrison shifted his weight slightly, crossing his arms over his chest. He flashed a quick, victorious smirk toward his mother Beatrice, who was sitting in the front row. Beatrice did not smile back. She sat completely rigid, her eyes fixed entirely on me, waiting for the explosion she knew was coming. I kept my breathing slow and measured. The heavy brass keys in my pocket pressed against my leg, serving as a physical reminder of the frail, sedated man I had left behind in room 14. Thomas Vance was depending on me. My own future was depending on me. I listened carefully for the specific cue in the ceremony. And so the priest said, looking up from his book and scanning the massive crowd of wealthy guests, "If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let them speak now, or else hereafter forever hold their peace." The priest paused. It was the classic dramatic moment built into every traditional wedding ceremony. It was a rhetorical question. Nobody ever actually answers it. The priest prepared to lower his eyes back to his book, ready to move on to the exchange of rings. The 500 guests remained perfectly silent, expecting the ceremony to proceed smoothly into the opulent champagne reception. Harrison relaxed his shoulders, letting out a quiet, arrogant sigh of relief. He thought he had won. I took one deliberate step backward, completely breaking physical contact with Caroline. Her hand fell awkwardly to her side. She turned her head, her perfect smile faltering into a look of sudden, genuine confusion. "What are you doing?" she whispered frantically. I did not look at her. I turned my back to my future bride, took 2 long strides across the marble platform, and reached out toward the wooden pulpit. I grabbed the heavy black microphone directly from its metal stand. The sudden movement pulled the microphone cord tightly, producing a loud, sharp screech of audio feedback that pierced the quiet cathedral like a siren. Several guests in the front rows physically winced and covered their ears. The priest stumbled backward in absolute shock, dropping his leather-bound book onto the floor with a heavy thud. I turned back to face the massive crowd. I held the microphone firmly in my right hand. My left hand rested calmly in my pocket. The silence in the cathedral was no longer polite or expectant. It was the terrified, breathless silence of a crowd witnessing a massive social disaster unfold in real time. "I object," I said. My voice echoed violently through the massive stone building. The words hit the wealthy crowd like a physical shockwave. 500 jaws dropped simultaneously. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. People began aggressively whispering to each other, shifting in their seats, craning their necks to get a better look at the groom who had just stopped his own high society wedding. Declan Harrison barked. He abandoned his position on the platform and took a menacing step toward me. His face was completely red with sudden explosive fury. "Put the microphone down right this second. You are having a panic attack." I turned my head and looked directly at him. "I am not having a panic attack, Harrison," I said calmly into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the cathedral heard my response. "I am simply answering the question." The priest asked if there was a lawful reason why this marriage should not proceed. And I have a very long, very detailed list of legal reasons. Harrison froze. He realized instantly that I was not breaking down under the pressure. He saw the cold, sharp focus in my eyes. He realized the obedient scapegoat had completely vanished. "Let us start with the 60-page prenuptial agreement. You tried to force me to sign exactly 3 hours ago." I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. I looked out over the crowd, addressing the 500 elite guests who thought they were here to celebrate a love story. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Declan Hayes. I am a senior financial auditor. I spend my entire life reading the fine print that corrupt people try to hide. This morning, Harrison Sterling ambushed me in the groom suite and threatened to completely destroy my career if I did not sign a new contract before walking down this aisle. The crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked murmurs. I saw powerful politicians and wealthy business executives exchanging highly uncomfortable glances. I pointed directly at Harrison, who was currently looking frantically at the private security guard standing near the side doors. "He told me the contract was standard procedure," I said, my voice echoing off the stained glass windows. "He told me it was designed to protect the Sterling family fortune." But I actually read the document. It was not a prenuptial agreement. It was an absolute assignment of criminal liability. The contract specifically named me as the sole managing director of 3 highly fraudulent offshore trust funds registered in the Cayman Islands. Caroline let out a loud, theatrical sob. "Declan, please stop," she cried out, playing the role of the humiliated, confused bride perfectly. "You are completely delusional. You are ruining our wedding day." I turned slowly to face the woman I had slept next to for 2 years. Her beautiful blue eyes were filled with fake tears. Her hands were shaking. It was a brilliant, flawless performance, but I was completely immune to her poison now. "I am not delusional, Caroline," I replied coldly, the microphone picking up the absolute disdain in my voice. "And this is not a wedding. This is a corporate restructuring designed to frame me for federal tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service is actively investigating your family empire." Your brother panicked. He needed a highly credible financial professional to take the fall for laundering tens of millions of dollars over the past 5 years. You brought me into your family. You manipulated my feelings, and you built a prison cell with my name on it. You were going to let me walk out of this church today and straight into a 20-year federal prison sentence. Harrison lunged forward. His perfectly tailored suit jacket flared open as he reached aggressively for the microphone in my hand. "Cut the sound system," he screamed at the back of the church. "Cut the audio right now. Get security up here and remove this lunatic from the building." I did not retreat. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor, lifted my free hand, and shoved Harrison backward with a violent, unexpected force. He stumbled down the 3 marble stairs and landed awkwardly on the floor in front of the first pew. The crowd gasped again, completely horrified by the physical altercation erupting on the holy altar. "Do not touch me. Harrison," I commanded, my voice booming through the speakers before the sound technician could even locate the right cable to pull. "You do not own me. You do not own the truth. And you certainly do not own the man you locked in a basement to fund your criminal empire." The entire cathedral fell completely dead. The whispering instantly stopped. The breathing stopped. The phrase "locked in a basement" hung in the air like a heavy, toxic cloud. Caroline stopped crying. Her fake tears instantly dried up, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain ghost standing in a white dress. "What did you just say?" Harrison whispered from the floor. His arrogant bravado was entirely gone. His eyes were wide with genuine absolute panic. I reached into the pocket of my trousers. I pulled out my smartphone and the thick stack of copied medical charts I had taken from the Black Site facility. I held the papers high in the air for the entire crowd to see. 5 years ago, Caroline Sterling became a tragic widow, I announced, addressing the terrified crowd once again. We all know the heartbreaking story. Her brilliant first husband, Thomas Vance, was lost at sea during a horrific storm off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The authorities searched for weeks, but never found a body. The federal court declared him legally dead. Caroline, grieved publicly, collected a massive $20 million tax-free life insurance payout, and everyone felt incredibly sorry for her. I paused, letting the silence build, letting the weight of the history settle over the room. I looked directly into Caroline's eyes. She was trembling violently now. She took a step backward, shaking her head in silent, desperate denial. But Thomas Vance did not drown, I declared, my voice striking the room like a hammer hitting an anvil. He never died. He was completely erased. The Sterling family needed an invisible influx of massive capital to build their offshore tax evasion scheme, so they faked the boating accident. They smuggled Thomas out of the water and locked him away in a private high-security medical facility 40 miles from this exact spot. Chaos erupted in the pews. Several people stood up from their seats. Shouts of disbelief and absolute horror echoed through the sanctuary. I saw Beatrice Sterling openly weeping in the front row, covering her face with her hands, finally allowing the terrible secret to destroy the family she had tried to protect. They placed him in room 14 at St. Jude Sanctuary. I continued, raising my voice to cut directly through the rising panic of the crowd. They stripped him of his legal identity. They labeled him Patient 874. They paid a corrupt medical staff $50,000 a month to keep him heavily sedated with chemical restraints so he could never escape and never call for help. I know this is true because I was standing in room 14 exactly 45 minutes ago. I looked Thomas Vance in the eyes. I spoke to the ghost you buried alive. Caroline let out a piercing, agonizing scream. She dropped her massive bouquet of white flowers onto the floor. The expensive roses scattered across the marble. She collapsed onto her knees, grabbing the sides of her head, completely unable to maintain the illusion of innocence any longer. The monster was finally completely exposed under the bright cathedral lights. "You are a liar!" Harrison screamed, frantically scrambling up from the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me, spit flying from his mouth. "He is a disgruntled broke loser trying to extort us. Security, arrest him immediately." The two private security guards rushed down the center aisle, reaching into their jackets. But before they could even reach the first marble step of the altar, the massive wooden doors at the back of the cathedral were kicked open with a thunderous, violent crash. "Nobody move!" a deep, commanding voice roared from the back of the church. Federal agents flooded into the sanctuary. There were at least 20 of them, wearing heavy tactical vests with FBI printed in bright yellow letters across the back. They carried automatic weapons and moved with absolute terrifying precision. The wealthy guests screamed and scrambled out of the way as the agents swarmed down the side aisles, locking down every single exit in the building. Agent Gregory Miller walked calmly straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the terrified billionaires or the crying politicians. He walked directly toward the altar, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. I stood on the platform and looked down at Harrison. His face was entirely frozen in absolute defeat. He looked at the federal agents, then looked back at me, finally realizing the true magnitude of his massive miscalculation. He had tried to buy a pawn to sacrifice on his financial chessboard, but he completely forgot that when you push a pawn all the way to the end of the board, it transforms into the most powerful piece in the game. I lowered the microphone from my mouth. The screeching audio feedback had finally been cut. The only sounds left in the cathedral were the heavy boots of federal agents and the pathetic broken sobbing of my former bride. "My grandmother always told me that your family did not buy love. They bought pawns," I said, looking directly into Harrison's terrified eyes. My voice was no longer amplified by the speakers, but it carried perfectly in the tense space between us. She told me that real power does not come from bank accounts or luxury estates. It comes from daring to stand up and face the absolute truth. You thought my poverty made me weak. You thought my lack of a designer tuxedo made me stupid. But the fortune you are so incredibly proud of is entirely hollow. I threw the stack of medical records into the air. The papers scattered and drifted slowly down to the marble floor, landing all around Caroline's designer wedding dress. "Your entire empire is built on blood, deceit, and the chemical imprisonment of an innocent man," I told them, turning my back on the Sterling dynasty for the final time. "And right now it is entirely burning to the ground." The thick stack of copied medical records scattered through the air like a sudden white storm inside the Trinity Cathedral. The heavy sheets of paper drifted downward, reflecting the warm, golden light of the massive chandeliers before landing silently on the polished marble floor. They surrounded the hem of Caroline Sterling's custom designer wedding gown. For a single agonizing second, the entire sanctuary remained completely frozen. 500 of the wealthiest elites in New England simply stared at the papers on the floor, their minds entirely unable to process the sheer magnitude of the crimes I had just exposed. The grand pipe organ was dead silent. The flickering candlelight cast long, trembling shadows across the elevated platform. I stood perfectly still, my breathing steady and calm, watching the illusion of the Sterling real estate dynasty shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Then the absolute silence violently broke. It did not break with a whisper, but with a massive, chaotic explosion of sound. Several guests in the front rows jumped out of their wooden pews, their expensive silk dresses and tailored suits rustling loudly as they scrambled backward, desperate to distance themselves from the epicenter of a federal crime scene. Shouts of disbelief and sheer panic echoed against the high vaulted ceilings. Politicians who had gladly accepted campaign donations from the Sterling family were already pulling out their phones, frantically calling their public relations managers. Beatrice Sterling, the matriarch who had handed me the keys to her family's darkest secret, remained in the front row. She was openly weeping, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the empire she had married into completely collapsed. I looked at her with a fleeting sense of gratitude. She had sacrificed her own luxurious life to save an innocent man, and in doing so, she had saved me. The heavy rhythmic sound of tactical boots marching down the center aisle completely drowned out the panicked voices of the wedding guests. 20 armed federal agents led by Agent Gregory Miller fanned out across the massive sanctuary. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, locking down the heavy oak doors and securing every possible exit. The private security guards hired by the Sterlings instantly surrendered, raising their hands and stepping away from the walls. They were paid to keep paparazzi out, not to engage in a shootout with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Harrison Sterling stared at the federal agents swarming his perfect, expensive wedding. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw hung open. For his entire life, Harrison had believed that his vast wealth made him completely untouchable. He believed that money could buy silence, rewrite reality, and bury any consequence. He had looked at me this morning and seen nothing but a disposable pawn, a working-class auditor, desperate for a taste of high society. He never once considered that the pawn would audit his entire existence and hand the devastating ledger directly to the federal authorities. The shock on Harrison's face suddenly twisted into something entirely different. The realization of his absolute catastrophic defeat mutated into a blind, explosive rage. His eyes went wide, wild, and entirely unhinged. He let out a visceral, guttural scream that echoed over the chaos. He did not run from the federal agents. Instead, he locked his furious gaze entirely on me. "You ruined everything!" Harrison roared, his voice cracking with pure venom. He lunged across the marble platform. He threw his entire body weight forward, his hands curling into violent fists, aiming directly for my throat. He wanted to physically destroy the man who had just dismantled his empire. I did not flinch. I did not step backward. I simply braced my stance, ready to defend myself, but I did not have to lift a single finger. Before Harrison could even close the 3 feet of space between us, 2 massive federal agents vaulted onto the elevated platform. They hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. The sudden impact sent Harrison flying backward. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket tore loudly as he crashed hard onto the polished marble floor, knocking over a massive vase of white roses. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, spilling cold water and crushed petals all over his designer clothes. Harrison thrashed wildly against the wet marble, screaming curses and kicking his legs, completely abandoning the refined, aristocratic persona he had carefully cultivated for 38 years. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a desperate, entitled criminal throwing a violent tantrum because he was finally facing a consequence he could not simply buy his way out of. The agents easily overpowered him. They pinned his shoulders aggressively to the cold floor, forcing his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing across the altar was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Agent Gregory Miller walked up the marble steps, his face a mask of professional stone. He looked down at the billionaire heir, currently pinned to the floor in a puddle of flower water. Harrison Sterling Miller said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, massive insurance fraud, kidnapping, and the illegal imprisonment of Thomas Vance. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you finally use it." Harrison stopped thrashing. He laid his cheek against the wet marble, panting heavily. His perfect hair was completely ruined, hanging loosely in his terrified eyes. He looked up at me from the floor, his chest heaving. The arrogant superiority that defined our entire relationship was completely gone. He was no longer the king of a corporate empire. He was just a terrified man realizing he was going to spend the next 2 decades rotting in a concrete federal cell. I stared down at him, my expression entirely cold and completely empty of any sympathy. He had tried to bury me alive this morning. Now he was the one in the dirt. As the federal agents hauled Harrison aggressively to his feet and began dragging him toward the back of the cathedral, my attention shifted. I turned my head and looked at the woman standing just a few feet away from me. Caroline Sterling was standing perfectly still among the scattered medical records. The magnificent sparkling diamond necklace resting against her collarbone caught the bright light of the chandeliers, highlighting the absolute ruin of her perfect facade. She was trembling so violently that the heavy silk fabric of her custom wedding gown was actually shaking. The brilliant, confident heiress who had casually helped fake her first husband's death to collect a $20 million insurance payout was completely gone. The flawless, loving bride who had slept next to me for 2 years while quietly building a federal trap designed to destroy my life had vanished entirely. In her place stood a deeply terrified, cornered predator realizing the trap had just snapped shut on her own leg. Caroline looked at the federal agents moving methodically through the crowd. She looked at her brother being marched out of the heavy oak doors in steel handcuffs. Then she looked at me, her large blue eyes filled with heavy, desperate tears. For 2 years I had believed every single tear she ever cried. I had held her in our bed while she wept over the tragic fake death of Thomas Vance. I had comforted her, promised to protect her, and given her every single ounce of my heart, because I believed her vulnerability was entirely real. But my eyes were completely open now. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was a master manipulator, and she was frantically trying to play her final desperate card. "Declan," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly fragile, completely broken, and designed to pierce directly through my defenses. She took a slow, hesitant step toward me. Her expensive high heels crunched loudly against the shattered glass of the broken vase. "Please, Declan," she sobbed, holding her trembling hands out toward me. "Please, you have to listen to me." I had absolutely no idea what Harrison was doing. "You have to believe me. He controlled the finances. He controlled everything. I did not know about the offshore trust funds, and I swear to God I did not know Thomas was still alive. Harrison told me he drowned. He forced me to sign those insurance papers. I was just as much of a victim as you are." She closed the distance between us, reaching out and desperately grabbing the fabric of my wrinkled white dress shirt. Her fingers dug frantically into my chest. Her tears spilled over her eyelashes, ruining her expensive bridal makeup, leaving dark, messy streaks down her pale cheeks. "You know me, Declan?" she cried, looking up into my face with absolute manufactured agony. "You know my heart. We love each other. We were going to build a beautiful family together. Please, you cannot let them take me away. You are the only person who can save me. Tell the federal agents that I am innocent. Tell them Harrison manipulated both of us. I will leave this entire family behind right now. I will walk out those doors with you and we can go anywhere you want. Just please do not let them put me in a cell." I stood perfectly still on the marble platform. I did not pull away from her desperate grip, but I also did not offer my hands to comfort her. I looked down into her tear-filled blue eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no lingering affection, no residual heartbreak, and no hesitation. The intense love I had carried for this woman had been completely eradicated the moment I walked into room 14 of the St. Jude Sanctuary and saw the frail, sedated ghost of the man she had thrown away to balance a financial ledger. I reached up slowly and grabbed her wrists. My grip was entirely firm, completely devoid of any warmth. I peeled her trembling fingers off my shirt, pushing her hands gently but forcefully away from my chest. "You are an incredible actress, Caroline," I said. My voice was low, smooth, and colder than the freezing winter air outside. It carried no anger, only the chilling, absolute certainty of a completed audit. You played the role of the grieving widow with flawless precision. You played the loving, devoted fiancé so perfectly that I completely ignored every single warning sign my professional instincts threw at me. You almost convinced me to walk down this aisle and sign my own life away." She shook her head frantically, her blonde hair falling wildly around her shoulders. "No, Declan, I am not acting," she pleaded, her voice rising in genuine panic. "I love you. I never wanted any of this to happen to you. Do not ever use that word with me again." I interrupted, my tone cutting through her lies like a sharp steel blade. "You do not love people, Caroline. You consume them. You viewed Thomas as a $20 million asset that needed to be liquidated. You viewed me as a convenient liability shield to absorb your federal tax crimes. You do not care that Thomas lost 5 years of his life in a heavily sedated nightmare. You do not care that I was about to lose the rest of my life in a federal prison. The only thing you care about right now is that you finally got caught." Caroline let out a loud, pathetic sob, her knees buckling beneath her heavy gown. "I am not your scapegoat anymore," I said, looking down at her one last time. "You built this cage with your own 2 hands. Now you must sit in it." I turned my back, walking out of the Grand Cathedral and stepping into the bright, cold sunlight entirely free. The days immediately following the disaster at the Trinity Cathedral felt like living inside the eye of a massive hurricane while watching the rest of the world get completely torn apart by the winds. I did not return to the luxurious apartment I had shared with Caroline. I rented a quiet, unassuming hotel room on the outer edge of the city, locked the heavy wooden door, and turned on the television. I sat on the edge of the cheap mattress and watched the untouchable Sterling family empire completely disintegrate across every single major news network. The story of the century broke before the sun even set on our ruined wedding day. The national media completely devoured the scandal with an insatiable appetite. It was the absolute perfect storm of high society glamour, staggering financial fraud, and a kidnapping plot so incredibly dark it sounded like a fictional psychological thriller. But it was entirely real, and the federal government was not holding back a single ounce of their massive institutional power. The arrogant billionaires who thought they could casually buy their way out of any consequence were finally facing an enemy they could not simply bribe or intimidate. On Monday morning, exactly 48 hours after I walked out of the church and left them surrounded by federal agents, the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a massive, highly coordinated raid on the Sterling corporate headquarters in downtown Boston. I watched the live helicopter footage broadcast across the morning news programs with a deep, cold sense of professional satisfaction. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers stormed the towering glass building. They marched through the pristine marble lobbies, completely bypassing the terrified private security guards, and went straight for the restricted executive floors. I knew exactly what they were looking for, because I was the auditor who had drawn the perfect map. Agent Gregory Miller led the forensic accounting teams directly to the hidden wall safes and the encrypted basement servers. They hauled out hundreds of heavy cardboard boxes filled with the exact physical ledgers, digital hard drives, and offshore banking tokens that Harrison had used to build his fraudulent Cayman Island trusts. The invincible fortress of the Sterling real estate dynasty was completely gutted in less than 4 hours. The financial fallout was absolutely catastrophic and incredibly swift. The moment the federal indictments were officially unsealed by a highly unsympathetic federal judge, the panic spread through the wealthy elite like a violent wildfire. Every single powerful politician, charity board member, and high society investor who had ever smiled and shaken hands with Harrison Sterling frantically scrambled to sever their ties. The massive holding companies that propped up their real estate empire completely collapsed overnight. Institutional investors pulled their capital out of every active development project. The major banks immediately called in their massive commercial loans, realizing the collateral was built entirely on blood money and fake tax returns. The Sterling family stock plummeted to absolute zero in a matter of days. They went from being worth hundreds of millions of dollars to being completely buried under an avalanche of federal debt asset seizures and crushing criminal penalties. I had spent my entire adult life watching corrupt executives hide behind expensive lawyers, but this was a mathematical execution they could never escape. The ledger was finally demanding to be balanced, and the cost was their entire existence. Then came the physical dismantling of their arrogant, luxurious lives. The federal government moved aggressively to freeze every single domestic and international bank account tied to the Sterling name, cutting off their access to the funds they needed to mount a defense. They targeted the physical assets next. I remember watching a local news reporter standing outside the massive $75 million private estate where we were supposed to host our lavish wedding reception. The towering wrought iron gates were padlocked shut with heavy steel chains. Bright yellow federal crime scene tape was stretched tightly across the grand mahogany front doors. The fleet of imported luxury cars, the exact same vehicles Harrison had used to mock my working-class background just days prior, were unceremoniously loaded onto flatbed tow trucks and hauled away to a dirty government impound lot. Caroline faced an equally brutal reality. She was formally evicted from her stunning Manhattan penthouse by armed United States Marshals. The woman who had obsessed over designer labels, expensive jewelry, and projecting the flawless image of high society royalty was forced to pack her few permitted belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, while federal agents recorded her every single move. She attempted to manipulate the media from her holding cell, releasing tearful statements, claiming she was a victim of her brother and a misunderstood widow. But the audio recordings from the church, combined with the undeniable financial documents linking her directly to the illegal trust funds, destroyed her fabricated narrative completely. She had absolutely nothing left. The wealth she had literally destroyed a man to protect was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying cold reality of a concrete federal prison cell. She traded a life of imported silk for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, and the poetic justice of her absolute ruin brought me a profound sense of closure. But the destruction of the Sterling family was only half of the story. The true justice, the profound moral victory that made every single second of my suffering completely worth it, belonged entirely to Thomas Vance. On the afternoon of the wedding, while I was holding the crowd hostage with the truth, the federal tactical medical team had successfully raided the St. Jude Sanctuary. They completely locked down the illegal black site facility, arresting the corrupt medical staff and breaching the heavy steel door of room 14. They rescued Thomas and transported him in a heavily armored ambulance to a top-tier federal hospital in the heart of the city. He was immediately placed under heavily armed protective custody. For the first 2 weeks, he remained in a highly secure intensive care unit as a team of specialized doctors worked around the clock to slowly and safely flush the massive amounts of heavy chemical sedatives out of his frail system. The withdrawal process was grueling, painful, and deeply traumatic for his body. But Thomas was a fighter. He had survived the freezing, violent waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and he had survived 5 years in a silent, drugged nightmare. I was not going to let the Sterlings steal another single day of his life. I visited him in the hospital on the 3rd week. The physical transformation was already incredibly remarkable. The pale ghost-like figure I had found trapped in a wheelchair in that dark room was slowly fading away. He was sitting up in a sunlit hospital bed, looking out a large glass window at the bustling city below. He had gained a small amount of healthy weight, and the cloudy chemical haze had completely vanished from his sharp blue eyes. When I walked into the room, he turned and smiled. It was a weak, tired smile, but it was entirely genuine and full of returning life. We did not need to exchange a lot of heavy words. We simply sat in the quiet, bright room, 2 men who had been targeted and hunted by the exact same monsters, sharing a profound, unspoken bond of survival. We were the disposable pawns who had officially marched across the board and taken down the corrupt king. Agent Miller and the federal prosecutors worked tirelessly alongside top civil rights attorneys to officially reverse the legal declaration of death that Caroline had fraudulently obtained 5 years ago. It was a complex, unprecedented legal battle filled with massive amounts of bureaucratic red tape, but the physical presence of a living, breathing Thomas Vance sitting in the courtroom made it an impossible case for any judge to deny. The federal court formally reinstated his legal identity, his citizenship, and his fundamental human rights. Furthermore, the court immediately seized the remaining balance of the $20 million life insurance payout that Caroline had stolen. That specific money, along with substantial financial restitution seized directly from the liquidated Sterling real estate assets, was transferred directly back into Thomas' legitimate name. He was rapidly regaining his vast personal fortune, but much more importantly, he was regaining his absolute freedom. I was finally going home to the massive, loving family that had spent 5 years mourning a grave that was completely empty. As the massive federal criminal trial approached, the prosecutors secured their absolute strongest weapon to ensure Harrison and Caroline would never see the outside of a prison again. It was not just the offshore bank records or the horrific medical charts from the black site facility. It was the matriarch of the family herself. Beatrice Sterling made the agonizing, incredibly brave decision to turn completely against her own children. She signed a comprehensive, ironclad cooperation agreement with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She handed over decades of private family journals, hidden safe combinations, and the exact names of the corrupt politicians, dirty lawyers, and offshore bankers who had helped Harrison and Caroline build their criminal empire. Beatrice voluntarily sat in a sterile federal interrogation room for dozens of hours, detailing every single lie, every single fraudulent transfer, and every single terrifying secret her family had buried in the dark. She testified in front of a federal grand jury, looking directly at the judge, and told the absolute unfiltered truth about the monsters she had raised. Her decision to testify completely destroyed her social standing in the city. Her wealthy friends instantly abandoned her. Her prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked, and she became a massive pariah in the elite circles she had once ruled with an iron fist. But Beatrice did not care about the lavish parties, the designer clothes, or the social status anymore. She had spent 5 long years suffocating under the crushing, toxic guilt of knowing an innocent man was locked in a basement so her daughter could buy a bigger yacht and her son could pretend to be a king. She testified against her own flesh and blood to finally atone for her terrible sins. Because of her unprecedented cooperation, and because she was the specific person who had physically handed me the keys to uncover the entire conspiracy, the federal prosecutors offered her a highly controversial deal. Beatrice Sterling was officially acquitted of all major federal conspiracy charges. She lost her massive personal fortune, her sprawling estates, and the real estate empire she had spent her entire adult life building, but she retained her physical freedom. She moved into a small, quiet, unassuming apartment on the rural outskirts of the city, completely removed from the toxic world of extreme wealth. She had traded her millions for a clean conscience, and it was undeniably the best deal the Sterling family had ever made in their entire history. The empire was completely reduced to ash. The arrogant billionaires who had tried to buy my silence, weaponize my career, and steal my future were currently wearing identical prison uniforms, waiting for a federal judge to hand down multiple decades of hard time. The offshore accounts were permanently frozen, the money heavily repatriated to the government and heavily taxed. The grand, terrifying legacy of the Sterling family was permanently erased from the city skyline, replaced by a massive, highly publicized cautionary tale about the fatal limits of greed, arrogance, and the illusion of untouchable wealth. I watched the final evening news broadcast reporting the seizure of their absolute last domestic commercial property. I pressed the power button on the remote, turning off the hotel television, and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace wash over my tired body. The complex, fraudulent ledger had finally been perfectly audited. The massive debts had been forcibly paid, and the absolute truth had completely set us free. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the Trinity Cathedral swung shut behind me for the final time. The massive media storm that followed the arrest of the Sterling family has slowly begun to quiet down, leaving behind a profound and absolute stillness in my life. I did not return to the high-pressure world of corporate financial auditing in the city. I realized I could no longer spend my days sitting in glass conference rooms, looking at the pristine balance sheets of billionaires and wondering what dark, terrible secrets they were burying beneath the numbers. Instead, I opened a small independent consulting firm in a quiet suburban neighborhood, dedicating my time to helping regular working people protect their modest businesses from aggressive corporate takeovers. My life is completely different now. It is smaller, quieter, and entirely honest. But before I could truly move forward into this new chapter, there was one final journey I needed to make. The air was sharp and biting on the Tuesday morning I drove out to the public cemetery on the southern edge of the city. It was late autumn. The towering oak trees lining the narrow asphalt paths had shed most of their leaves, creating a thick, colorful blanket of red and gold across the damp grass. This cemetery was absolutely nothing like the immaculate, heavily guarded private grounds where the wealthy elites of Boston buried their ancestors. There were no towering marble mausoleums here. There were no grand statues of weeping angels or massive iron gates. It was simply a quiet, respectful place, resting on a gentle hill filled with rows of modest granite headstones marking the resting places of ordinary people who had lived ordinary, hard-working lives. I parked my car near the iron fence and walked slowly up the familiar path, the crisp autumn leaves crunching softly beneath my leather shoes. I stopped in front of a small, unadorned gray stone. The engraving on the front was incredibly simple, bearing only a name and 2 dates. Ruth Hayes, my grandmother. I stood in the quiet morning air and stared at the letters carved into the granite, feeling a deep, overwhelming wave of emotion rise in my chest. I reached into the inside pocket of my wool coat and carefully pulled out the small, worn white envelope. The paper was even more fragile now, the edges heavily creased from the countless times I had folded and unfolded it over the past 6 months. It was the exact same letter Harrison Sterling had thrown onto the mahogany table in the groom suite. It was the exact same piece of cheap grocery store notepad paper that had ultimately brought a $75 million criminal empire crashing down to the ground. I knelt on the damp grass and gently placed the folded letter on top of the cold headstone. I looked down at my left wrist. Peeking out from the sleeve of my coat was the scratched, faded silver watch she had given me on the day I graduated from college. The second hand ticked with a loud, steady, and beautiful rhythm. I remembered the morning of the wedding, standing in the luxurious suite wrapped in imported silk, feeling completely suffocated by the heavy expectations of the Sterling family. Caroline had begged me to take the cheap watch off. She had offered me a $50,000 platinum timepiece, telling me I needed to look the part of a wealthy heir. She wanted to strip away the final piece of my true identity and replace it with a shiny, expensive chain. But I had refused. That cheap silver watch was the only honest thing in that entire cathedral, and it had kept me firmly anchored to reality when the psychological pressure was designed to completely break my mind. I reached out and rested my hand against the rough granite of the headstone. "You were absolutely right," I whispered into the cold autumn wind. The sound of my own voice felt incredibly small in the vast, quiet space of the cemetery, but I knew she could hear me. I sat down on the grass, ignoring the dampness seeping into my trousers, and allowed my mind to wander back through the years. I thought about the woman who had raised me. Ruth Hayes did not have a college degree. She did not have a diversified stock portfolio or a network of powerful political connections. She spent her entire adult life scrubbing the floors of downtown office buildings, working grueling double shifts just to make sure the heating bill was paid and I had a warm winter coat. Her hands were permanently roughened by harsh chemical bleach and endless physical labor. But despite her absolute lack of material wealth, she possessed a towering, unshakable moral clarity that the Sterling family could not even begin to comprehend. She always told me that you can measure the true character of a man by looking at what he does when he thinks nobody is watching, and by looking at how he treats people who have absolutely nothing to offer him. The Sterlings believed they were living in a completely different universe. They lived behind high iron walls and tinted limousine windows, surrounded by a constant echo chamber of lawyers and sycophants who told them they were brilliant and untouchable. Their massive wealth had completely insulated them from the normal consequences of human behavior. They thought they could rewrite reality simply by throwing enough $100 bills at a problem. When Thomas Vance became a financial inconvenience to their massive tax evasion plans, they did not see a living, breathing human being with a family who loved him. They simply saw an asset that needed to be liquidated and erased. When they needed a perfect scapegoat to take the fall for their federal crimes, they looked at me and saw nothing but a naive working-class boy desperate for a taste of their luxurious lifestyle. They thought my lack of a trust fund made me weak. They thought my love for Caroline made me completely blind. They fundamentally believed that because I grew up in a small house and wore a cheap watch, I would automatically bow down to their power and sign whatever fraudulent document they pushed across the table. That was the fatal arrogance of the super-rich. They were so blinded by their own golden reflection that they completely failed to recognize the quiet, dangerous strength of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a massive empire of lies, hiring the most aggressive defense attorneys on the eastern seaboard and paying off corrupt medical staff to keep their darkest secrets locked in a basement. Yet their entire criminal syndicate was ultimately dismantled by a single sentence written in shaky blue ink by a woman who used to clip discount coupons from the Sunday newspaper. I stared at the letter resting on the granite stone. They do not buy love, they buy pawns. I still do not know exactly how my grandmother understood the true nature of the Sterling family before she passed away. Perhaps she had read an article about their ruthless business practices in the local paper. Perhaps she had simply lived long enough and seen enough of the world to instantly recognize the cold, hollow eyes of predators hiding behind expensive designer smiles. Whatever her reasons, her final warning had crossed the boundary of time and death to arrive at the exact moment I needed it most. It was the catalyst that woke up my auditor instincts. It was the spark that gave me the courage to look past the blinding glamour of the wedding day and see the terrifying steel trap waiting just beneath the surface. If that letter had not arrived in the groom suite, I might have allowed my fear to overcome my logic. I might have signed that 60-page contract just to keep the peace and appease the woman I thought I loved. I thought about Caroline sitting right now in a highly secure federal penitentiary. The national news networks had completely destroyed her carefully crafted public image. The beautiful, tragic widow had been exposed as a ruthless architect of human suffering. I wondered if she ever looked at the concrete walls of her small cell and realized the absolute poetry of her punishment. She had forced an innocent man to live in a locked, windowless room for 5 years so she could fund her extravagant lifestyle. Now the justice system had stripped away her imported silk dresses, her diamond necklaces, and her Manhattan penthouse, placing her in a locked room of her own. She had traded her entire soul for a mountain of stolen money, only to discover that you cannot bribe the passing of time and you cannot purchase a clear conscience. Her brother Harrison was facing a similar nightmare, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, forced to realize that the rules of gravity apply to everyone no matter how high they build their golden towers. The contrast between their ruined legacy and the quiet dignity of my grandmother's grave was absolutely staggering. The Sterlings had dedicated their entire existence to hoarding wealth and projecting an image of absolute superiority. They left behind a legacy of shattered lives, federal indictments, and a family name that will be permanently synonymous with greed and corruption. Ruth Hayes left behind no money, no property, and no famous name. But she left behind a legacy of absolute truth. She taught me how to stand up straight when the world tells you to bow down. She taught me that integrity is the single most valuable currency a human being can possess because it is the only asset that can never be stolen, frozen, or heavily taxed by the government. The moral foundation she built inside me was the exact weapon I used to tear the Sterling Empire to the ground. A gentle gust of wind swept across the cemetery, rustling the dry autumn leaves and breaking the profound silence. I reached out and picked the letter back up from the headstone, carefully folding it and placing it securely back into the inside pocket of my coat. I did not need to leave the letter behind. It did not belong to the past. It belonged to my future. It was a permanent reminder of the massive fire I had walked through and the man I had become on the other side. I looked at the name carved into the gray granite one last time, feeling a profound sense of closure settle over my tired heart. I had balanced the most terrifying and important ledger of my entire life. I had walked the ghost out of the dark basement. I had forced the monsters into the light, and I had protected the good name my grandmother gave me. "Thank you," I said quietly, the words carrying a lifetime of gratitude. "I will never forget." I pushed myself up from the damp grass, brushing the dirt from my knees. I turned my back on the quiet headstone and began the long walk down the winding asphalt path toward the iron gates of the cemetery. My footsteps were light, completely unburdened by the heavy expectations of a society I no longer had any desire to impress. I did not need a $75 million trust fund to validate my existence. I did not need a mansion in the hills or a fleet of luxury cars to prove that I mattered. I had my freedom, I had my professional integrity, and I had the absolute certainty that when the ultimate test of character arrived, I did not break under the pressure. I walked past the wrought iron gates and stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk, pulling my wool coat tighter against the sharp autumn wind, ready to finally start living a life that belonged entirely to me. They choose glamour, I choose truth. If you have ever been forced to be a pawn in someone else's game, if you have ever been told that you are not wealthy enough, smart enough, or powerful enough to control your own destiny, remember that you always have the power to overturn the board and completely change the game. True power does not come from the numbers in a bank account. It comes from the courage to stand in the light and refuse to live in the shadows of someone else's lies. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear the next stories. The truth will always find a way to the surface, and I will be here to share it with you.